One of the most important things you're going to do when you're creating an app is actually something that your users never actually see, and that's creating the back end of the app, the server or whatever it is, providing the data to your application. So one of the most popular ways of doing this is by using a Google service called Firebase, and it was a company I believe they bought a few years ago, and they've improved it somewhat, and it's a great option these days. So we're going to start to understand how to use something like Firebase by creating a very simple WhatsApp clone. Basically, it's an interconnected chat so you can chat with other users, and we're going to do lots of fancy things with it, but we're not going to make it too complicated, just so you get the idea of Firebase. Now, obviously, WhatsApp is a very popular app, and you're probably never going to exceed its customer base, which is, I believe, over 1 billion people at this point. But what I'm giving you is the seed to create something similar of your own. So it doesn't have to be WhatsApp. It could be, a fishing chat app, or pick a hobby, and you could use Firebase to create a chat app really quickly and easily. Now, stuff like WhatsApp is actually powered by what we call a cloud database, and that's just a fancy new terminology for something that's actually quite old. So we have our app, we have the internet, and we have a database sat somewhere on the internet. Now, when people say cloud technology, all they mean is some database somewhere out there that's storing your data and delivering it to your app. Now, of course, we could use our own server for these purposes. It's perfectly reasonable, and you could program it in pretty much any language you like. PHP would be the classic version of that. But we can actually develop a nice little shortcut, and we can use Google Firebase. So it's a whole backend as a service, and you can search for backend as a service for your app or your desktop application or whatever it is by simply typing in the acronym BAAS into Google, and you can see what other backend as a services are out there. And the reason these are popular is because stuff like Firebase has basically created the backend and the database for you, and it's created the network reliability that your app needs. Whereas if you roll your own database, you could have some issues with reliability. Okay, so in this section, we're actually going to look at CocoaPods again, installing some SDKs so we can use Firebase in our app. Of course, we'll look at how to use Firebase. We'll also create a user registration system that perfectly integrates with Firebase and also sends users stuff like forgotten password emails or change password or confirmation emails. It does all of that automatically. We don't have to think about it. We'll also look at how we receive live updates from Firebase. So what we can do in the app is subscribe to when something changes in Firebase, and we'll get a notification when that thing has changed, and we can show it to our users. So we don't have to do what's called polling. We don't have to go and ask the server if there's something new. It simply tells us when something new turns up. And of course, there's a whole lot more between all of that. So if you're ready, let's go. The first thing we're going to look at is how to actually set up Firebase for use. It's pretty straightforward. We just need a browser and a Google account to do it. But first of all, I'm just going to introduce you to something called Pass. Now, Pass was the same idea as Firebase, and it was a few years ago that it decided to actually wind down. Now, if you are already familiar with Firebase and your app is sort of scaling up quite well, you might want to actually look at Pass because I believe they've open sourced their code so you can run your own version of a Pass server. So that's just something for you to note. But in the meantime, we're actually going to look at Firebase. Now, the other reason I bring up Pass next to Firebase is that they're actually quite similar systems. They do the same sort of functions. So I'm just making you aware of what's out there and the fact that Pass is open source and therefore virtually free, whereas Firebase is pay as you go. Okay, let's open up a browser and get Firebase set up. The very first step is to go to firebase.google.com. Now, if you have a Google account already set up, you can simply use the sign-in link at the top right, or when you click sign in, you can also register a new account if you wish. So let's try that. Let's go ahead to sign in and create or sign in with a Google account. I'll sign in with my account and see you in a few seconds. Right. Once you've done that, all you have to do is go to console at the top. And this is going to take you to the main interface or the starting interface for Firebase. Now, all you have to do, as you might guess, is click Add a Project. It asks you for a name, so we can call this the actual app name that we have. You can select a country or region, and that may have some billing implications for you as well as analytics data. So you might want to research which country or region you want to put this in. Okay, after you've done that, just hit Create Project. And this will set up the complete Firebase backend for you. Now, the backend of Firebase is actually a NoSQL database. So it's a database without any structure, as well as a whole host of other items. And you can see them all on the left-hand side. You've got analytics, you've got authentication, so you can auth your users, database storage, hosting, just tons and tons of items if you scroll up and down. It also integrates with AdMob quite well. Okay, so clearly, if we look at the main interface, we have iOS, we have Android, and we have web app. And we are making an iOS app. So all we have to do is add to our iOS app. So if we click this, let's see what happens. It asks us for our bundle ID. So we haven't actually created that yet, and we'll come back to creating that. And then you have some other items you can put in there. And if you look up at the top, we have register, we have download config file. So this will give you a config file. It will also tell you how to add the Firebase SDK to your app and then add initialization code to make sure everything works. So it's pretty handy in the way it helps you set things up. So we're not going to do that for now. We're just going to cancel it. For now, we're going to click authentication. Now, this allows you to set up a sign-in or registration method for our users. And if you look up at the top, we have users and sign-in method. Click sign-in method, and you'll notice that everything is actually disabled. And this is by default for security reasons, obviously. You don't want anyone to be able to get in to your app whilst you're developing it. But later on, you will. So we're going to enable email password. And if we click this little pencil icon on the right-hand side, we can click enable and save, and it will tell us it's enabled. Now, we can also allow the users to register by phone, Google, Facebook, and any other accounts that we have. You can also have anonymous, but be careful with that. It's best to leave it on email password. Okay. There's also a ton of other information down here, but most pertinent is one account per email address. And you can change that if you wish. You can have creation of multiple accounts with the same address, but don't do that. I would advise you to have the one account per email so users can't do it. Make tons of accounts and spam your server because you will pay for it through Firebase. And finally, down here, we have manage sign-up quota, and this prevents denial of service attacks. Or not denial of service, more like it prevents multiple registrations of accounts from the same IP address. So it only allows 15 per hour. Totally up to you if you want to change that. Completely up to you. I find that the default is fine until you have any issues. Right, so we've got email password set up. We are ready to actually begin creating our app and adding Firebase to it. Okay, we're just going to set up our very simple app, and we are not going to change anything in the app yet because the focus of this section is to actually install Firebase using CocoaPods and make sure everything's working, Firebase is configured, it can connect to the internet before we actually start changing stuff in our app. It's a method I advise you to use pretty often, is that if you have a complex thing to add to your app, try to do it at the start so you remove all of the potential errors that other items can actually have, so you can troubleshoot, for example, Firebase, if something goes wrong. So let's open up Xcode and see what we should do. Right, let's create a brand new Xcode project. Simply click the link. For now, we're just going to have a single view app. Hit next. Let's call this something obvious like chit-chat. Leave your organization and your identifiers as they are or as you want them to be. Hit next. And what we'll do is just save that on your desktop or somewhere convenient. So our main app will be created. Now that it's done, we actually want to copy over our bundle identifier. Let's go back to Firebase. Let's go to our overview of the app and click Add Firebase to your iOS app. Now notice it wants your bundle identifier in here, so we're just going to paste that in. So if you change that in the future, you will have to change it here as well. We're going to leave our nickname and our App Store ID. Actually, we could change our nickname to the actual name of the app. This is for your own identification. We don't have an App Store ID yet, so it doesn't matter. Hit Register App, and what it'll do is give you an info plist. And if you remember, plist stands for property list. It's just a file that contains some text data we can read. So click Download Google Service info.plist. And that will go ahead and download. And notice that it tells you to install that inside your application. Right, so let's head over to our application, go to the chit-chat, right-click it, and if we look, we can add files to here. And we can go to our downloads, and we can select our Google Service Info. And it tells us we've got some weird error. Who knows what that meant? Let's try again, shall we? Downloads, Google Service Info, doesn't like it. Right, so you know what we'll do? We will actually create a new Finder window. We'll go to Downloads, we'll get our plist, and we will drop it in. And when you do that, it'll pop up with a little dialog box, and you just need to click Copy Items if needed. Hit Finish, and there we have it. And if you click the plist, it shows you exactly what is inside it. So there's our bundle ID, here's all the project IDs, and it's just a whole bunch of data allowing us to actually connect to our Firebase account. Right, so let's go back to the web app. We've got it there. We can click Continue. And it tells us, all the stuff I've told you before, is the instructions to install CocoaPods and create a pod file. It's got this link at the top to CocoaPods, and you can click that if you wish. And it just takes you to the main CocoaPods website. So we can close that. And now all we need to do is create our pod file. So let's go back to our project. Let's open up a terminal. Let's type cd space desktop, or rather we can actually just have cd. We can open up a Finder window, and what we can do is go to our desktop, get chit-chat, and we can click and drag that into the terminal, and it auto-fills it for us. Hit enter and we're in. And to make sure we're in the right folder, we can click ls to list everything. And as long as it matches everything here, which it does, we are okay. So we're going to initialize our pod file. But before we do that, let's close Xcode, Command Q, and pod init. Aha, I appear not to have pod. I've just updated Mac OS X, so I'm just going to go fix that. See you in a second. Right, now that I've done that, we can run our pod init, and we can watch all of the files that get created, which amounts to a whole file. So let's right-click this, let's open it with, let's go to Other, and let's look for Xcode. It's always a good idea to open these with Xcode rather than a plain text editor. Okay, so pods for chit-chat. What do we need in here? Well, first of all, we need the pod called, And what is it called? Well, if we go back to our browser, it's called this, Firebase Core. So we can actually just copy that and just drop it in here. Okay, but that's not all we need. On a new line, we need a different pod, which is Firebase /database. And then we can save that. Let's make sure our use frameworks is on. Yes, we are sorted. Okay, so just double check what it says here. We've got our init. We can actually install stuff. So we can go back, we can save this, and we can quit it. Then we can run our pod install command. And that will go ahead and fetch our Firebase items for us. So let's just double check. Oh, I can see this is going to be a while, so I'll see you in a couple of seconds. All right, once that's done, everything should be installed, and that probably does take quite a while depending on your system. So let's open up our XC workspace file now. Remember, don't open Xcode project, but the workspace file from now on. If you open up the Xcode project, you can actually mess up a few things to do with CocoaPods. So obviously, you don't want to go through that. Right, so now we have our chat, we have our pods. Let's open up our main project. Let's let everything index. So up at the top bar here, we can see it's doing what it needs to do. And our next step is to initialize our Firebase CocoaPod. So if we go back to our browser and we hit continue, we get up to our add initialization code, and it gives you Swift or Objective-C. So this tells us we need to connect Firebase when app starts up, and the init code we should put in the app delegate class. So all we have to do is import Firebase and then put this line in there. So let's actually look at that, appdelegate.swift. So this is the file, or the bit of code, if you like, that gets loaded when our app first gets loaded up. So you'll notice that inside of this class called appdelegate, we have a few functions, like the application did finish launching with options, and the application will resign active. And if you read these comments here, they tell you what these things all mean. Application did enter background. So these are kind of hooks onto which or into which you can place your own code in order to, for example, save some data if your app is going into the background, and then bring the data back if your app is coming back into the foreground. So will enter foreground as an example, or it did become active. But it's also the place where we can initialize stuff before the GUI, if you like, of our app is actually loaded. And of course, the first thing we actually want to initialize here is to import Firebase. And you'll notice we have all the items we need in there. So let's import Firebase. Let's go back to here, and that's exactly what we need. And then inside the did finish launching with options, we need Firebase app.configure. So here it is. Before return true, we're going to put it in there. So let's have Firebase app.configure. Now you notice there are actually two configures that you can have. Let me just type that again so it pops up for us, where you can actually put your Firebase options in, or you can give the configuration a name and add the options too. But when you just have plain configure, it knows to go and look for this Google Service Info.plist. So we don't have to add any other options. So obviously there are other ways you can do it. So if that works, we're going to save it. We're going to go to product and build. And we're just going to double check that all builds and our Firebase CocoaPod is actually working. And we've got a build failed. Who knows why? The first thing to check is to actually clean it. And once we've cleaned it, then we can build it again. And what I'm going to do is actually run this on the simulator, the iPhone SE. So hit play and let's load it up. Now it's building at this point, or compiling if you like, and hopefully that is going to compile successfully. If it doesn't, well, we can fix it, because we are developers after all, are we not? Build succeeded. There you go. So if you ever run into problems, just always clean and then rebuild your app. So when this actually loads on the simulator, we're going to find out if this Firebase app is actually configured correctly. And we'll know that because we won't have any errors showing. And there we have it. We have our nice blank app. And if we go over to our console and just move this around a touch, we can actually fully expand it, but I like to have it half up there. We've got a whole bunch of messages that tells us failed to register for something, but that's nothing to do with Firebase. But if you look up here, we have some messages to do with Firebase Analytics enabled. And we've got a whole bunch of other Firebase items. So let's keep going. It's quite hard to actually separate these out. I wish they would put a line break in them, but they don't, so never mind. Anyway, as long as you've got a few Firebase successful messages, then Firebase is actually ready to be used inside of your app. And as long as you don't have any major errors around that, you are good to go. So we can stop that running on our simulator, and our Firebase is ready to use. Now we're going to look at actually firing up our Firebase code. So what we're going to do is design the login screen, and we're going to code the background all in one lecture. Now, this is a pretty long lesson, but you should be used to this by now. I like to slowly introduce you to longer and longer lessons to give you a feel of what being a coder is like, because you code the best code when you're actually in flow and not jumping from 5-minute to 5-minute sections. An hour or two, and you can produce some really good stuff. Right, now that I've said that, let's go on to how we handle stuff like registration and login. Well, the first way we can handle it is like this. We can load our app, we can tell our user to register, and then they can use the app. But there's a problem with this design in that if your user just downloads the app to check it out, they don't necessarily want to give you their details. They don't want to register it because they're not invested yet. So that could actually be quite a bad design case, depending entirely on what your app is about. You may need to register them, as you may need to register them in a chatting app, obviously. So the other alternative is to load the app, allow the user to use it, and then ask them to register when they try to perform a certain function. Right, so we're going to do one of these two ways in these lectures, and it's not important which way we do it now, because we're just trying to understand how this login and registration works. But this is for you to think about a little later on when you're making your own apps. How do you handle this register use or use register sort of scenario? Okay, so let's open up Xcode and start designing our login screen. Right, let's open up our main storyboard, and we're going to drop in a login view controller into here. So we can just get rid of these sidebars, or just one of them, and we can drop in another view controller. And remember, we can select these using the object filter, and if you get the wrong items, it's probably because these icons at the top are incorrect. So select the object item, and you will have view controller available to you. Right, so click and drag that in. Anywhere is fine. Right, we have a view controller for login. So let's give this view controller an ID. Have it selected, and over in the attributes inspector, we can give this a title if we wish. And also in the class inspector, we can give this a storyboard ID. So obviously we need this. Let's call this perhaps login view controller. Hit enter, and it will be applied. So this is the string we're going to use in order to find which view controller to open up if we want to open it up programmatically. Right, let's give this view a background. So just click the view itself. So over on the left, you can actually select it in the view controller. Let's change its attributes, and let's change the background color by clicking the background icon to a custom color. So you can select these 3 sliders, go to RGB. You can also do hex color. I'm going to do hex color, and I'm going to give this a 96 dB 37. This is just a color I've selected previously, and if you hit enter, it'll apply it. So it gives us a nice green color, and this is actually going to come out looking a bit different on the app itself, because when you have it selected, it kind of makes it darker. And if you deselect it, that should be the color it now comes out as. Right, now we're going to show this view controller on our app. So we need a way to navigate to it. And that means somewhere in our main view controller, we actually need a nav controller. So let's select this main view controller, and we know it's the first one because we have this arrow that tells us that. And what we do is go to Editor, embed in a navigation controller. So now we can just shift this across, and now we have a nav controller. So if we go from this controller over to this one, we have a navigation controller in the background that's doing the lifting for us in terms of navigation. Right, now we can come back to our app itself. We can scroll across and go back to our registration view controller. So obviously the first thing we need is some kind of input text box. So just type text, and text field is editable. So we'll drag one of those in. We will give this perhaps a width, and feel free to create your own version of this app. You don't necessarily have to exactly copy what I'm doing. So I'm just going to make this 140, make the height 44, and add those constraints. And then I think I will center this horizontally in the container. I can actually make this a little wider, I think. Give your user something nice and big to tap on. So 200. And the width, I'll make this 54. So it hasn't changed the width yet, but it will. And then we are going to align this vertically in the container. Okay, I think it's actually a bit too high, that is. So let's drop it back down to 40. Okay, now I'm just going to shift this up a bit. Let's see if I can remember if it's minus 100. Yes, it is. Okay, so we've got our text field, and this is going to hold the email address. But we need our user to know that, so we can simply select the text field, go over to the Attributes Inspector. Let's scroll down and see if we can put some kind of placeholder. There we have it, placeholder text. So let's have email address popped into there. Okay, now we need another box for passwords. So let's hit Command-C on that box, Command-V and paste it. Perfect. We can change our placeholder to password. And we can center these to each other. So hold Control, click and drag. And let's center, let's see, we can do leading edge, that's fine. And we can center it one to another with vertical spacing. And that should be all centered. So the centering of these elements is actually around this email address box. If we move the email address box down, then you can clearly see that everything else is going to drop down as well. So email address and password. I'm just going to select that email and remove those 3 dots. I don't think it looks that great. Okay, so we've got that sorted. Now with this text entry box for the email address, let's scroll down in our properties and let's go to content type. Let's look and see if we have email address. And by doing that, that should give us a keyboard that corresponds to an email address. So it gives the @ key, or puts the @ key within easy reach of the user. Then with our password box, we don't actually want people to see what's going on. So our content type might be a password. Now that should actually put asterisks over the password so people can't easily see it when it's typed in. So email address, password. You'll also notice with both of these, capitalization is turned off, which you might expect for an email or password. Okay, now with the password, there's one more thing actually. You have to select secure text entry. So that will put the asterisks over it, or the dots, or whatever version iOS is using. Right, so we've got our 2 boxes. Now we need a button, obviously, to log in. So let's go find one. Button, click and drag it over. Let's change that button style a bit because we need it to match our app. I'm going to select a white color for it. And I'm going to turn up that font. You can put a custom font if you wish. Just going to increase the size, double click it, and let's call this log in. Then let's give that button a width and height. Now the height should technically be 44 as a minimum, because that's what iOS or Apple would prefer things to be. So I do make it 44. It's a good idea. Control click and drag, put some vertical spacing, and we can also center that horizontally, so everything slots in nicely. So we've got our login button. We can copy that, we can paste it, we can double click it, we can hit register, and we can also copy that and paste it, or just paste again. And this is for forgot password. Sorry for the swearing, but that was quite funny. Forgot password. And enter. And the forgot password one, I'm going to make it a little bit smaller in the font department. And perhaps lowercase might be. Okay, so we have our 3 buttons. Forgot password. What we can do is align them to each other. So let's have these aligned vertically. Let's drop it into the middle. And then let's have forgot password somewhere down here in case, yeah, we want to make it distinct and separate. So we can control, click, and vertical spacing, and as usual, horizontally. So it's really up to you how you space these things out. Let's change that width to 150. Is that fitting? No. I forgot my sword. 190. Forgot password. Perfect. Okay, so that's pretty much our login screen sorted. Now we can actually put a label in the top. So let's do that to give our app a bit of feel. And by feel, I mean give it a sort of logo. You can drop in an image view here if you wish. That's totally up to you. I'm just going to align this centrally. I'm going to change the color to white. And I'm going to select a custom font. Let's see what we've got here. What's this Giza Pro? No. Damascus. And we want, well, ideally, I think I want something that's italics. Old style. Book italic. That's not too bad. We can increase that size, of course. Let's see what 60 looks like. Yeah, that looks quite nice. Sure. Chat. Of course, it's up to you, whatever you want to use. Okay, so we can center that as usual horizontally. And I'll center that vertical spacing too. So we have our chat. Perhaps we should give this a width to make sure it doesn't actually get cut off at any point. So 250, I think will do it. Okay, that's a nice, neat looking, simple login screen. It's obvious what it does. Now we need a view controller class for this login screen. So let's click Add New File. Go to Cocoa Touch class and search for UI View Controller. And it should get filled out for you. And what are we going to call this? We can call this actually Auth View Controller, short for authentication. Because login or registration, it does both of those, and we don't want to write both of those because it's a lot to write. So let's create that as Auth View Controller. Now let's go back to our main storyboard. Let's select our view controller and let's apply that in the class. So there we have auth view controller. And what I'm going to do actually is I'm going to change this login view controller to auth view controller, not Autka. Auth view controller. There we go. So just a slight modification there to make everything line up correctly. Right, so we've got that. Let's start outletting. Let's open up our assistant editor, top right icon, and let's start dragging stuff over. So first of all, we have our email address box. And this is known as a UI text field. So we should call this email text field. So we know what kind of thing it is. Same with our password. Password text field. And then we want our login and register buttons. So let's drop these down somewhere here. Whoops, that's a mistake. Command Z, Control, click and drag. Let's have an action. Login clicked. Let's have the same for register as a action. Register clicked. And finally, forgot password clicked. Forgot pass clicked will do as an action. And connect. Right, so we have all the connections we need for all of our text items. So whatever happens on screen, we can actually do something with our login register / forgot password. So let's close the assistant editor and we should be good to go. And the way we test that is by going to product, build. And if everything links up nicely, we are more than 50% of the way there. Excellent. Now, I did say I was going to do some code in this particular lecture, but I think we'll leave it at design and we'll actually move on to the code in the next lecture. Now that we've created our Firebase registration and login screen, we can actually get to attacking the code for logging in. Now, this is going to be very useful code if you use Firebase in the future, because obviously you're going to have a template that you can just more or less copy and paste into any of your new apps wherever you need it. So let's go ahead and see how logging in is done. Now, as we haven't actually built a registration system yet, that's coming up, what we actually need to do is head over to our Firebase console, click authentication for our app, Chat, and we need to add a user in here. So just click add user. Add any old email like test@test.com and any old password. I'll just use the classic password and click add user. Now it's worth noting you can't actually change the password in this interface without clicking reset password, and it will send a reset email password to that particular email address. So if you want to do that, make sure you actually own this address. But anyway, we now have a temporary user or a permanent user set up for our app. So if we go back to Xcode, and let me just put these sidebars back on, let's head over to our auth view controller.swift, and it's inside of here, obviously, that we're going to try and log in. Now, the very first thing we need when we log in is actually to have the correct imports for our Firebase. And what do those imports look like? Well, these imports are actually Firebase/auth. And if you recall, if we just open up Finder and we open up our pod file, and of course to do that we need to close Xcode just to be sure. Let's open up our pod file with Xcode itself. If you recall, in our pod file, we hadn't actually included the auth part. We have core and database. So what we need to do is have a pod, single quote, Firebase/auth. And all of these things are available as documentation in the Firebase documentation. It'll tell you what to do. So now we can save that. We can quit Xcode. We can open up a terminal. We can cd into our project as we have before, hit enter, and type pod install. And that should go off and get our Firebase auth for us. So there we go. It's installing our Firebase auth. Okay, so we can close terminal and we can open up our workspace again. So it's very easy using CocoaPods to actually install things as we need them. Right, in our auth view controller.swift, let's have a class level variable somewhere near the top. And we're going to call this var logging in. And this is going to be a Boolean. So we're going to say true to start with. Okay, let's save that. And this is going to keep track of whether we're logging in or not. We'll see exactly how it keeps track of that in a bit. Okay, now we need a Firebase login function somewhere. So let's come down to the bottom. We can actually remove this did receive. We can actually remove the navigation bit just to make everything a bit tidier. And we can just type our own function. And this function is going to be login. Or we could just leave it as login actually. Open and close brackets, open and close our curly braces. Right, so the first thing we're going to do when we log in is we're going to make sure there is actually an email address that's been entered. And we're going to make sure there's a password that's been entered that's greater than X number of characters. So we can have if, and we can have, it's not label, it's text field, email text field, dot text, and this is optional, so question mark, dot, and we want the number of characters, dot count. This returns the number of characters. And if this is, let's say, less than 5, then open and close our braces. We can do something about it, like warn our user. Okay. What have we got a problem here with? Oh, I think count. Yes, we need to put it like that. Okay, because we're unwrapping it. But we know that this actually exists and the text in it actually should exist. Well, we'll find out if it crashes or not. Okay, so we've got all of that. Now, if this is less than 5, we want to tell the user that what they're doing is wrong. So what we can actually do is change the background color of the email text field. So dot background color is equal to UI color dot, or we can actually set a UI color and we can choose one of these items, perhaps a red, green, blue. That's the one with our CG floats. And we can also give it an alpha. So what we want to do is make this kind of a red color. So we'll have a high number for red. We can tab to green. We can have a lower number, such as 0.1. I'm not sure what this is going to look like, 0.1. And we can make this almost see-through, 0.2. So it's going to be pinky red. You can adjust this to taste if you like. Then if this is the case, we're actually going to return. So it's going to exit out of this whole function if this isn't correct, if it's too short. Okay, so we've checked that. Now, if they change it in the future, we actually have to change that color back. So what I'm going to put here is an else, and I'm just going to copy this background color, and I'm going to reset it back to its UI color dot white. And that should put it back to where it actually needs to be. Right, so we fall through here. Now we need to check the password field. So if the password text field dot text And again, we're going to count the characters for this one. And if this is less than 5, we are going to do something about it. So again, let's unwrap that. And what are we going to do? Well, we'll do something similar to everything else. So we can actually, we have .count, .yada, yada, yada. I've put my bracket in the wrong place, excuse me. There we go, if it's less than 5. Right, so what are we going to do? Well, we're going to just copy this email text line where we change it to red, and we're going to change it to the password text field. So it'll change that to red instead. Let's remove that exclamation. And then we'll have an else for that case as well. Password text field background color is that. So that should sort out everything we need to do in that sense. Right, assuming we can get through there, we can actually invoke the sign-in function. So let's grab the let email is equal to the email text field dot text. And that's an optional, but we can actually unwrap it. Let's have our let password equal to password text fields dot text unwrapped. Now we can begin the Firebase authorization. So what do we need to import first of all? Well, up at the top, let's import and just type Firebase, and it should be obvious. We need Firebase auth for this. Now let's scroll back down and let's start logging in. Auth.auth. And auth comes from that Firebase auth. So this is the class, and this is going to be the instance of it, and then dot, and just type sign, and it gives you a whole bunch of options to sign in, sign out, etc. So these are related to the credentials for authorization. Now, if you want to do Google Auth or Facebook Auth, there are slightly different steps, and you'll have to go to the documentation to understand that. But in our case, we just want sign in with email because that's what we have. So first of all, our email is this email that we've created. The password is the password we've grabbed from the text field. And on completion, we can obviously do something with that. So on completion, it returns back an optional user, an optional error, and then executes some code. So we can call this user simple user, and the error is just an error. Now in the code, we can check these items to see if our sign-in was successful. So if it wasn't, then we are going to have an error returned. So if let error is equal to error, and all that's doing is checking if something exists in this optional error. And to make it less confusing, we can actually call it ERR. What can we do? Well, for now, we'll just print it out to ourselves, something along the lines of error, and then we can give ourselves an error.localized description. And we'll make it more obvious for us. Error signing in. So if there's an error, we as developers know it. And obviously, if you're here, you don't want to try anything else, so you're just going to return. Okay, excellent. Otherwise, if it works, we can simply print signed, not at signed, signed in. And we can add our user. Now this is optional. So question dot, and we can have a display name and email. Display name, I'm not sure what that'll come out as. It might actually come out as the email if you haven't actually set it, but we'll just put email. So this will show us we've actually returned the correct item. So email. And let's just correct this. So it needs to unwrap the whole thing. Now, there's potential for an error here, so I would be careful with this. But for now, there we go. But for now, we'll just leave that as it is. And if we crash, well, I'm pretty sure we'll know it's something to do with this. Okay, so that's our login screen, right? But we haven't actually got a way to show it yet. So inside of our main view controller, so this is the one that gets loaded up, our view controller.swift, when we first start up, we can actually import Firebase. And we can also import Firebase auth. Now you'll notice it's got a strike through on it, and that's because it's probably being imported as part of this Firebase. So you can import bit by bit or all of them. But what we're going to do is just import Firebase auth, keep our app nice and lean in this part. Now, in our view did load, we can check if a user is already signed in, because obviously we don't want to show the login screen if they're not signed in. So let's have a function to check current user, something like that. Open and close our braces. Now inside of here, we're going to say if our auth dot, and we can ask for the current user. If this is equal to nil, let's see if that works, because Firebase has changed a bit, then we can do something about it. And what are we going to do? Well, we're going to present our user with that login view controller. Let view controller equal to. Now, how do we get the view controller from our main storyboard? If you recall, it is this one and it has this ID. Well, it's actually pretty easy. If we go back to our view controller, let VC equal to self dot, and we can actually pull up the storyboard we are currently sitting on. And once we've got that, we can try to instantiate a view controller with an identifier. And if you recall, that is exactly what we have. So this is a string, and this was auth view controller. And it's always a good idea to double check that, because that's a place at which your app could actually crash if you get it wrong. Okay, so we got our lovely view controller. All we now need to do is self.navigation controller, and that navigation controller is the one that we embedded in our app. So this section here. So we are currently working in this view controllers class. And when we say self.nav controller, we're actually pulling up this nav controller and we're putting up this view controller on top of it as a stack. So this is keeping track of everything that we're doing. So view controller, self.nav controller. And that's a question mark because it is optional. Dot. And we're going to present a view controller. So it's going to be this option here because we have to give it one. So view controller to present, that's VC. Animated, yes please. And on completion, we don't actually want to do anything, so we can just have nil set for that. So we can save that, and then we can have check current user fired up in our view did load. So we can save that. And that's going to overlay our login view controller. Right, excellent. Let's try that out on our iPhone SE. Right, so this is a great way of actually programming this. It's responsive, it checks if we're logged in, and oh, I've made a silly mistake. I know what it is. It is the view controller is optional. So what we can do here is say if let the view controller is this, then we can load up the nav controller. So let me just confirm that for you. I'm just going to move these off to the side so you can see the single lines. Right, so all I've done here is say if we can get a view controller out of this, then try to load it. Right? So put those sides back and let's load it into our iPhone. So yeah, so like I was saying, this is a great design tool for you to check something and then fire something up without making a user press any buttons like login or already logged in or something. So there we have our brilliant navigation controller showing our screen. And you'll notice there is no back or anything in here, which is great because we don't want the user to exit out of here unless they log in or register. Now notice if I click login, nothing happens. If I go to email address and click R and click login, nothing happens. And more annoyingly, when I click the background, the keyboard doesn't go away, even if I click return. But the password functions great. Can't log in still. Return, nothing happening. Right, so let's come back to here and let's stop that running. Let's fix that little keyboard issue where we can't press outside of it and dismiss the keyboard first of all. Now the way that this works is first of all we have to create what's called a tap gesture recognizer. So our app can recognize when we tap somewhere on the screen that isn't one of those views. So up at the top of actually we want to do this obviously in auth view controller. So up at the top, we are going to say let tap, and this tap is going to be of type UI tap gesture recognizer is equal to a new UI tap gesture recognizer. And this is going to have a target and, of course, an action. So what's the target? Well, it's self. Self is the current view controller that we're in. And the action itself, whoops, we don't want that, self selector. Now, the action is the method or the thing that we're actually going to fire off. So the way we can specify this is by typing hash selector, and Xcode might correct me slightly on this because I believe this has changed. Open and close our braces, and then we specify this current view controller. So auth view controller dot dismiss keyboard, and we haven't created dismiss keyboard yet, but we will as a function. Okay, so I knew there'd be a slight error. Let's just click it. No dismiss keyboard. It's coming, don't worry. Okay, now what I'm going to do actually is, let me think about this. I'm going to cut this and I'm going to paste this into view did load as the first thing that we do, because there's one more bit of code we have to add to it, and that is to add this gesture to our current view. So view, and you could type self.view or just view, and this view is the background view that we can see in our main storyboard. So this item. So once you've got that, we can say view dot add gesture recognizer, and we can feed it the gesture recognizer tap that we just created. Now let's create this dismiss keyboard function. Func dismiss keyboard. And then it's really simple to do. We say view dot end editing, and we're going to force it true. So we're saying end all of the editing, which is going to drop the keyboard for us. So I'm going to save that and I'm going to run it in the sim. And now when we tap outside of the sim, we should be all sorted and the keyboard should actually disappear for us. Eventually, oh, my build has failed. I knew it. Click the little icon. Argument of selector refers to instance method dismiss keyboard that is not exposed to Objective-C. I'm going to click fix, but I'm not sure that's going to do what we need. Okay, so what I'm doing here is I'm actually using Objective-C terminology to fire this up. So don't worry about that for now. It's something you'll pretty rarely have to do, apart from when you have a more complex app. But as we get more mature with Swift, you won't have to worry about that. Right, so now I'm going to click my email address, type something, tap somewhere outside of it, and the keyboard goes away. Same with password, tap outside, it goes away. Does it work if we click a button? No, it doesn't. So in that case, the button captures the tap, but not the view. Click the view or the label or anything else, and the keyboard goes away. Okay, so we've sorted out that little problem there. Now all we have to do is actually log in when we click login clicked. So all we got to do is type login. Simple enough. Now let's hit play, and we're going to use our test login email address rather. So it'll load it up. Let's go with test@test.com. Let's type in our password and click login. And nothing happens, nothing gets dismissed. That's fine, we're still testing. But you'll notice over in here, we get that print back that says we are signed in as test. And that comes from this line. Now, if we stop that running and we run it again, and then we go back to our sim, in theory, our app should keep that login token from Firebase, and it will say that we are already actually signed in, and it's not therefore going to pop up that screen. So there you go, it's not actually doing anything to log us in. So that's fine. Our logic in our code in viewController.swift on check current user is actually working. So it comes to this line, we do have a current user, so it keeps us logged out, or logged in rather, and doesn't actually show us the auth view controller, which is perfect. It's just what we want. Now, I'm not sure about Firebase, but I believe there is a timeout or a useful life of the login tokens of, I don't know what it is, but let's just call it 7 days for argument's sake. After 7 days, your app might log your user out and they'll have to log in again, or the tokens could be infinite time. And I'm not actually sure if you can change that, but that's something for you to be aware of. Right, so whenever the app closes, the user doesn't get kicked out in terms of registration or login, or just login. Right, now whilst we're testing, what we would actually like to do is have a test function that logs us out each time. So function logout. And the purpose of having this is that whilst we're building login and registration, we don't want to have to revoke the login token over in our Firebase dashboard. We just want it automatically to happen in the app so we can keep testing it. Once we got past this part, then we can remove the logout function. So I would normally call this logout test to sort of remind me to remove this later on. Okay, so first of all, we are going to sign out of our app. So let's try a slightly different way of doing this. Let fauth, Firebase auth, equal to auth. So I just want you to see, you can actually have this as its own separate object. If that's the way you want to code, totally up to you. Now, what we're going to try and do is sign out. But when you sign out, there could be an error because you might not be signed in. So we're going to catch this error. We're going to use what's called a do catch statement. So we're going to do something, and then we're going to catch any errors that come out. And these are going to be called whatever you want to call them. So let sign out error. And this is a type of NS error. Okay, so all it's doing is it's trying what's going to be in here. And if there's an error, it's going to come down to here and give us an error. And we're just grabbing the error and we're saying this is going to be a type of NS error. Okay, it's just standard sort of syntax for this bit. So inside do, we have to tell our system that there might be an error. So we're going to say we want you to try something. Try get our Firebase auth. Now, I believe Firebase auth, is that optional? No, it's not. Dot sign out. And look at that. There's a throws keyword there. And throws goes hand in hand with try. And what it does, it tries to do this, and if it throws an error, then this section catches that error. So you can see what they've done with the language naming there. You throw something, you catch it. Right? So when that throws an error, this bit is going to catch that particular error. So it would be handy if we could print that out to ourselves. Error signing out. And then let's give ourselves that sign out error. Right, so that should print out a dot. Do we have a string? A localized description. There we go. So that will give us that. Now, obviously, we want to log out before we check the user. So log out test. Save that and let's run it. Let's go over to our app. And now it should log us out. So it brings up the registration screen each time, just whilst we're working on it. There we go. So we're logged out. Right, so we're logged out. Let's stop that running. Let's hit play. Let's go back to our app. So we're currently logged out. Let's see if over in our console we have any errors related to this error signing out. So you can actually filter this console. Go down to the filter box right at the bottom and type error. And no, we don't have any errors. Okay, that's fine. So stop. Now, there's no errors, but we weren't logged in. So you might have been expecting this catch to fire on that error. But it didn't actually do that because, well, who knows? It's just the way Google have coded it. I know previously there would have been an error. But Google have still coded this defensively to throw an error. And you might wonder, why is that? Well, it's because this is going out to the internet, right? Or actually, what this is doing, I believe, is just deleting a token on the device. So I don't really know why you'd need to check for an error here. And I mean, if you know better, then please do write in the lecture, ask a question and tell me what's going on. But I expect Firebase to change that at some point. Anyway, that's by the by. We now have a nicely working login system. It still needs some polishing, but we'll get there in the end. All right, so far we've got a login component on one of our screens, which looks a little something like this. Now, you may have noticed we actually have a register button, and this is for a user who doesn't have an account to register within our app. So they'll provide an email address and a password. And what we're going to look at is the registration flow for this app and how we actually register a user using an email address and password via Firebase. So rather than actually reinvent the wheel and have a separate registration screen, we're going to reuse the email address and password. But instead of clicking login, the user's going to actually click register. And when they do that, we're going to give them a pop-up that says, please confirm your password, because it's always a good idea when you're registering someone. Make sure they've got the correct password. And once they confirm that password, the password is correct, they will be registered. So let's go have a look at how this is done. Now, here we are in our auth view controller. And when our user presses the register click button, we actually want to check they've entered an email and a password of a character count greater than 5. There are other checks you can do, but that's just the basic one we've got. Now, we've already done this in our login click. So if we go to the login function, we have everything we need here. Right, so what we have to do, rather than recreate all this code, is simply cut this code, Command X, and let's create a function down here called something like check input. And then paste our code in. Okay, now we are actually just returning out of this, and if we call this function check input inside of our login, check input, that should work, yes. It's going to go through this function, it's going to go in here, and it's just going to return, and then it's going to keep going through here, which is no good. So we actually need a way to check the output of this function. So what we should do inside the function itself is return a Boolean of some sort. There are only two sorts, Grant, sort it out. So check input. If this is this, then we're actually going to return false. Excuse me, I've got a new keyboard here. It takes a bit of getting used to. Okay, so that will return false. And then also this section here, we can also return false. Really can't type today. Return false. So if either password or email is incorrect, we're going to return false. And then coming up here, we can check it by saying if check input is false, so you put an exclamation before it, then we can return or give the user a message depending on how we code this. Right, so in check input, we're going in here. If that's wrong, it's false and it returns. Else, it'll change the color to white. So if it does that, that's okay. If it doesn't go through the password text field check, it'll go into the password text field check here and change it to white. That's fine. So assuming the whole code falls through everything, then we can go ahead and return true. So there we go. Our error has gone. Right, so you notice what I've done there. Rather than return true in here, which would create a different kind of spaghetti code nightmare, I've just used logic and thought about if it falls through everything, everything must be correct. So that's a handy programming technique to know, that just let your code fall through, and if it does fall through, you can assume either it's correct or incorrect depending on how you've coded the thing. So it's a handy technique to make a note of. You are making notes, of course, aren't you? Right, so we've got that little check input, and we can copy this check input here, and we can put it into a new function called register, and paste it at the top here. So now we have our check inputs sorted. Now let's see if we can actually put this all on one line. That might be very useful. So let's bring that back up there. I think this should be doable. I've seen stuff like this before. Yes, that just makes our code a little bit neater. And it's pretty obvious what these functions do. Right, so we have our register function ready to go. Now we need a bit of code to show the user a pop-up so they can actually confirm their password, because remember, they can only enter it once at the moment. So in order to do that, we're going to use an alert, which if you recall is a type of view controller. And the way we instantiate one is by going UI alert controller. And we just want a very simple title, message, and a style for this. So the title can be anything you like, register, and the message can be please confirm password, and the style can be an alert. So you'll notice this is displayed modally for the app. That means it's shown on top of your current view controller as its own view controller. Right, now the beauty of alerts is we don't actually have to just stick with buttons and messages. We can add certain UI elements to them. So alert dot, and if you just type add, you'll see what you can do. Add action, add text field, add key command. Okay, we want a text field, obviously, and this will allow us to input some letters or text or whatever it is. So if we just hit enter on that, it'll fill in everything we need to, the coding structure, and we just give this text field a name. And the reason we have it passed in here is so we can access it inside of this code block. Okay, now we can give this text field a placeholder text is equal to password. Now you'll notice that this may be a question you have. Placeholder is an optional, right? So it might or might not contain the string. But because we are assigning a string to it, we don't have to have any checking of the optional or not because we are actually putting something inside it. Okay. So once we've got that, we need then a button, which is an add action. And it requires a new UI alert action, so just hit enter, open your bracket, hit enter, and it will tell you everything you need. You need a title, obviously, and this is going to allow the user to cancel this particular item. The style is going to be default, but feel free to experiment with the styles. And on completion, we're going to have nothing, or when you hit the button, nothing's going to happen. So this is obviously, as the name implies, a cancel button, so the user can exit out of it. Then we need another alert action, which, as you guessed, is going to be the action that confirms and actually registers the password and the user. So the title is going to be OK. The style is dot, not a string obviously, but dot default. And the handler itself, well, do we actually need a handler for this? Yes, we do. So let's hit enter and type action or something like that. Let's get rid of this code hint. Now we need the password confirmation that comes from this text field. So how do we actually get that? Well, we say let's say password confirm is equal to the alert that we're currently in, dot. Now we can't just access that text field. You'll notice you actually get an option to have text fields, which is an array of text field. And that means we actually have to iterate through all the text fields. Now we know there's only one, which is here. So this is going to be at index 0. Remember, everything is at index 0. Now text fields, if I just type it again, is an optional because there might not be any. So I'm going to force unwrap it because I know it's definitely there. And we are going to take the first one in that array, which is at index 0. Now be aware, if you hadn't added text fields, exactly here is where you would get a crash when your app is running and the user presses this button. Okay. So, yada, 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 whatever you say. And just going to double check because I know in the old version of this code, that you actually had to cast this. But I don't think we do now. And by cast, I mean you have to say as a UI text field. But I don't think we actually have to do that now. We'll soon find out. Okay, the next step is to compare this password to the one that the user entered previously. Right, so if password, what do we have here? Password, no, it's password conf. I've put a capital W there, that's why I'm confusing myself. Password. I don't know why it's not showing it, but anyway, if password conf, now you might think you would have equals equals, but there's actually a better way to do it in text, in Swift rather, is to grab our text dot is equal, so is equal, and this isn't showing, but whatever, is equal to what? Well, the old password, so self dot password text field dot text, and that's an optional too, so we're going to unwrap that. So if these things are equal, then we can do something. Let me just move this off the side here so you can see. And let's double check. There we go, everything has gone. So if this confirmed password is equal to the password we already have, then we are good to go. Let's just put a comment in here. Registration start or something like that, so you know what's happening. Now we can grab the email and the password itself, and how can we do that? Well, we can actually just copy this line from login, these two lines. And of course, we could actually have had this right at the start of the register function after check input. Totally up to you where you want to put these. So we have our items. Now all we have to do is get our auth, get our instance of authorization, and then, as you might guess, start typing, oh, not register. That would be a wrong guess, wouldn't it? Annoyingly, it's not register, but rather it's create user with email, password, and then a callback. So what's the email? Well, it's the email we just pulled out the top there, which currently has an error, and that's because it requires self. Same here. And just to confirm for you guys, it requires self because at the moment this add action is happening in its own handler. So we have to explicitly refer to this class by using self. So it's a bit of a complicated process, but hey. And then our password is the string password. And on completion, we can actually do something. So we can tell our user if there was an error. So if we double click this callback, it's the same code you probably recognize from login. So you'll have a user object passed over, and you will have an error object passed over, and both are optional. Right, and because they're optional, we're going to check them. If let error or is equal to error, then what are we going to do? Well, we could show the user an alert here, but for now, we're just going to return. And I'm going to let you guys do the alert in the homework section. Otherwise, if there is no error and we have a user, we can print out to ourselves, the developers, something like new user. And we can have user, but we should probably check it if let iglet. Told you I had a new keyboard. If let user is equal to user, then we can print out the user email, for example, like we did with login, if you recall. Okay, so we've got all of that running. We get a callback, and we need to unwrap this email. Okay. Now, what else do we have to do here? I'm just thinking of this. So we've got our callback, our auth. We're going to fall through. We're going to check the user, the error. I think what we're going to do here, if we get this, if we actually get a user, then what we can do in here is we can now dismiss this view controller, as in the login view controller. So what do I mean by that? Well, I mean in our app, this is loaded up. We've just registered a user. So what's the logical step in the auth view controller? Well, that's to actually dismiss it because we don't need it anymore. So we can self.dismiss, and we can animate this, and on completion, we don't need to do anything. So what this is going to do is take that view controller, the auth view controller, off the top of the stack and throw it away and take us back to the original view controller. Right, so that's our alert done. It's quite a lot going on in the action there. Right, and we have one more thing we have to do, and that's actually show the alert. So self.present, and remember an alert is a view controller. So alert, animated, and on completion, nil. Whew, okay. And we've got a slight warning here, so let's print something to ourselves. Let's have reg failed plus error.localized description. Okay, so we have a ton of stuff going on here, which is fine. Let's hit play. And let's see if we can register a new user. I'm hoping so. And remember, our app automatically logs out. So let's have an email address, harry@hotmail.com. And I'll just use password. And then I'll hit register. And we have nothing. And I think that's because, let's stop that running, I have actually forgotten to actually call register in register clicked. It's always the simple stuff in life. This is like my weakness as a coder. I make the whole functions do everything beautifully, and I just forget to call them. So it's crazy the things that you can get wrong. All right, so let's try this one more time. harry@hotmail.com. And if you hit tab on your physical keyboard, it'll take you to password. Password, register, please confirm password. Password. Now, you can actually change that text field property to be a hidden one. So we can actually do that whilst it's still running. So next time we run it, it'll be okay. If we look at our add text field, we can have a text field dot, and I just have to remember, it was type, wasn't it? Or it was something like privacy. I think I'm going to have to search this out. If we go to our storyboard, we can find it. Sorry for going off on a tangent, but it's good to fix these things. Go to password, go to its properties. Content type is password, and secure, that was what I was looking for. Dot is secure text entry equals true, and make it password type. Text content type is equal to dot. Was it password? Let's go back to our storyboard. Yeah, password. So content mode, not that one. For sure it's not that one. I'm pretty sure it's the first one. Is equal to dot. Come on, Swift. There we go. I think I'm going to have to find this somewhere. So you know what? I'm just going to leave that password out for now. So we'll just leave it. All right, and we'll come back to our app and we'll continue where we were. So I'm going to hit OK, and this should register a user and get rid of that screen. So it's gone through here, it's successfully registered, we have a new user, so it's dismissed the screen, and it tells us in our console we have a new user. Now obviously we can stop that running, and we can actually go and check that in our Google Firebase console. Right, so if we go over to our browser, go over to our console and click Authentication, we can see in our list of users we have Harry at hotmail.com who has a unique user ID. Now I believe this unique user ID is actually unique across all of Firebase. Don't quote me on that, you'd have to check it out, but I believe it is, or it's certainly long enough to be unique. So that's how we create our users and register them in our app. Now obviously our app is falling a bit short of the user experience at the moment because the user has no way of knowing what's going wrong with their registration or login. So in the next lecture, I'm going to set you a little bit of homework, which is based around alerts and a bit of logic, just telling the user what's happening and when it's happening. So I'll see you in the next one. Alrighty, it's time for your first piece of homework in this module. And there's a couple of things wrong with our app, primarily in the login and registration screen. And I want to set you 3 tasks to fix these items. Now, the first item I want you to fix is to create a generic alert, perhaps a utilities class like we have before, where you can feed a title, a message, and a button title maybe to an alert, just to let the user know that they failed a login or there's an incorrect registration, they've re-entered their password incorrectly, something like that. Just a generic way that the user can know that something has gone wrong. So that's your first task. Your second task is to allow the user to reset their password. So if you recall, we have a forgot password button in our app, and when the user taps that, you want to send them off an email, and Firebase does that automatically, so it's pretty simple, but you will need to perhaps look up the Firebase documentation or simply search on Google to see how to do it. It's not too difficult. And then finally, once you've done that, just give the user a pop-up telling them to check their email for the reset link. And that links back to point number 1 or task number 1. You'll just use that generic pop-up again in your utilities class. So pause the video here and good luck. Have a really good go at it before you come back. Welcome back. I hope you had a really good go at solving those problems I set you. Here's a little reminder before I show you my solution. I asked you to create a pop-up for failed login, registrations, whatever it was, just a generic pop-up. Also to allow the user to reset their passwords. You'd have to look at a bit of Firebase documentation to do that. And then finally, use that pop-up you created to tell the user to check their email once they'd sent the reset password link. So open up your Xcode and let's see how I would solve this problem. The very first thing I would do is create a new file called utilities or something similar to that. It's just the way I program. It's not a standard way of programming. There is no standard way really. So you could create any named file that you wanted to, but it just so happens that this is how I've always done it. Whoops, and ignore that autocomplete there. I open and close our braces. Right. Now we need a function in here which is going to show an alert. Now this is going to take a title, which is a string. That's going to be the title of the alert. It's going to have a message, also a string. And then it's going to have one more thing that it needs. How do you show an alert? Well, you present it. And you present an alert on top of a view controller. So you actually have to pass the view controller over itself. UI view controller. And to do that, you're going to have to import UI kit, so it knows what UI view controller is all about. And then we're ready to go with our function. Right, so that's probably a bit that caught you out when you were trying to do this, just that little section. Right, now we can just create a simple alert, which is equal to a new UI alert controller. And you know how this goes by now. We have a title. So we're going to give it the title that we pass in. We're going to give it the message that we pass in. And we have to give this a style dot alert. And then we're going to give this an action, which is a simple button, alert dot add action. Hit enter, and you can create your new action with a title, a style, and a handler. So the title is simply going to be OK. The style is dot default. And the handler is nil. Now, just a little something of note here. Instead of default, you can actually have other items, cancel and destructive. So destructive will give you a red background, if I recall correctly, or something similar that implies that you're going to delete some data. In this case, we're not. It's just an alert. So default is fine. Cancel, it gives a cancel flavor to it, so nothing will be changed. Default is fine for us, just so you know, because you use alerts quite often in iOS programming. Right, now we need to show the alert. So we get that view controller we passed in, and we present the alert itself. So alert, animated, and on completion, there's nothing, because this is just a message to tell the user. So we can save that utilities file, and we can go back to our auth view controller because the alert is now ready to show. Now let's look at the places where we would actually insert that alert. So we've got all the bits and pieces. We have login register, and in both login and register, we check the input. And if the input is wrong, i.e. here, then we can do something about it. So in this case, if the email text field is wrong, we can actually create a new utilities.showAlert, and we can say email incorrectly formatted, something like that. Or actually, we'll cut that, Command X, and we'll just say error, and we'll put that as a message instead. And we'll pass it over the view controller. So that's just self, because this whole auth view controller inherits from UI view controller. So self is what it is. Right, so we can copy that over, and we can put it into our password text field, error, password, too short. And it will return. So that takes care of that entry when we check the actual input. So now let's concentrate on this login function. So we've checked our input, it's all good. We've tried to sign in. If there's an error, then we should probably paste in our show alert here and say error. And then the message, well, that could be anything you like, but you have to remember that the localized description will actually tell us what the error is. So you can show that in the message to the user. Now, it depends if you actually want to show this, because sometimes these descriptions that come back from Firebase and other cloud database providers are quite technical, and you don't want the everyday average Joe to see that because it implies a level of unrefinement, if you like. It's not even a word, I know, but it implies you haven't made an effort to refine your app. Firebase is okay with their descriptions. They're a bit more readable. So we can leave this as it stands. Now, we can copy this. And if we wanted to, once the user's signed in, we could give them a notification. But it's sort of implicit that once they're signed in, that view controller drops down and they'll be able to use the app. So I don't think there's actually a need to do that at this point. So we'll just leave that as it stands. Right, so now let's go to our register section where we made a custom alert with our text fields to confirm the password. And what we did was when we hit the button, OK, we checked if the password text was equal to that, then we started the registration. Well, what if it's not actually equal? Well, we should have an else statement where we tell the user that. So this is a handy trick in Xcode. If you go to a brace or a bracket and you move back and forth over it, you'll notice that over in the top here, where I've selected this line, it highlights its counterpart, so where it opens and closes. So just by going back and forth, you can tell where you are. So we know this is the correct place to place an else. And then we can tell the user that they are actually wrong. So we can paste it, error, and what are we going to do? Well, our description, our message, isn't this, obviously. It is going to be something like, let's think, error, passwords don't match. Okay. And then that should just kick out of it and give them a chance to click register again, but we can check that in a bit. Right, so the next error that we'll come across is if registration failed. So we can just simply paste that in, and we can leave it as a localized description because, again, this is an error. Now, if the user registers, we get a new user, and then we dismiss the view controller. Now, again, we could put an alert in here, but we have to be very, very careful when we're doing that. If we put an alert here, it would show the alert, but an alert is asynchronous. So the alert shows, and the code in the background keeps running. That means it's going to go to this next line, and it's going to dismiss the view controller that the alert is actually showing on. Now that is a whole bag of worms, a whole can of worms waiting to be opened. Generally, you want to stay away from that. So what you would do if you really wanted to show an alert here, and I don't think it's necessary, is create your own custom alert, and when the user presses the OK action button, then and only then will you dismiss the actual view controller. So I'm not going to do that here because it's enough for the user to know if the screen disappears that they are actually registered. Right, so we can save that. We can hit play. And we can check that all of these alerts and whatnot actually work correctly. Okay, so I'm just going to put in a too short an email address and click login. Email incorrectly formatted. Great. So I'll make it long. I know it's not an email address yet. I'll click login, password too short, login. And this, the email address is badly formatted, comes back from Firebase. This is the error.localized description. So that's great. So what we'll do here is we'll put an @ and we'll say hotmail.com and we'll log in. There is no user record corresponding to this identifier. The user may have been deleted. And this, you can see what I mean when I say these services sometimes have sort of bad descriptions. They're great for us as developers. They tell us exactly what's going on. But to a user, you're like, whoa, what does this mean? Have I been deleted? No, it just means that username and email is incorrect. That's all it means. So it's a bit frustrating, but hey, let's try harry@hotmail.com. And that's capitalized it, so that's a thing we should fix as well. We can log in with that. the password is invalid or the user does not have a password. And this also brings up another point, that we have two different errors here, both for an email address. And if I was a hacker, I would be looking at this and saying, right, so the first email address doesn't exist, but this second one does actually exist because the error is different. The password's the same, but the error is different. Right, and that is a clue that you don't want to leave behind for hackers, right? You just want to give a generic error, say, login error, please check details. That's all you want to do. So it's up to you how you do that. We're not going to do that right now because it's a bit beyond the scope of this. But anyway, let's change this to Harry R. Oh, we need to switch off autocorrect on this, that's for sure. Or harrys@hotmail.com. We can register that. Put the wrong password in. Passwords don't match. Excellent. Right, so let's try register Harry with the standard password of password. Register. Password. Okay. And we are registered as harrys@hotmail.com. So it looks like our logic and the flow of printing out errors and showing the user alerts is actually working. Now we're going to move on to the next bit of the homework, which was to allow the user to reset their password. And if you recall, in the Firebase console, we can click next to a user and we can reset password, which will send a reset. You can actually also change your email template. So if you click change email template, it will tell you what you can do. So this is just Google's default, and you can just hit the little pen icon and you can have all of these items changed. Okay, but we want to do that programmatically because obviously manual is going to be a pain if you've got 1 million users and 100 of them forget their password every day. So in our auth view controller, under forgot pass clicked, we can actually do that. So let's create a function down here somewhere. Function. Let's call this reset password. And then let's call that function, so I don't forget it this time, in the forgot pass clicked button click. Okay? So reset password. Now, what's the first thing that we actually have to do? Well, we don't want to check the input because they forgot their password, and obviously we can't check the password. So all we're actually going to do here is say if, and we're going to check that something is empty. So let's say if I forget what it was called, the email text field dot text dot is empty. So this is a Boolean. So if it's empty, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to tell the user, first of all, say sort it out. So we know how to do that now. We have a nice utilities. Utilities.showAlert, and we have a title error. We have a message. Please enter your email address. And we have the view controller, which is self. And then after that, we're just going to return out of this function to allow them to fix that. Okay. But if everything is all good, we can grab the email, which is equal to self.email text field dot text. Whoops. Okay, and you can put an if-let there, but we've just checked if it's empty, so it's not really necessary. Right, now here comes the Firebase stuff, because we only need an email address to reset a password. Let's have auth.auth. And you can just start typing things you might think it is, such as reset. We have verify password reset code, send password reset. That sounds like it. So let's try that. It asks for an email, so we've got that already. And on completion, we have what's called a send password reset callback type. So just hit enter and it will autofill the structure for you. This gives back an error, and this, I believe, is not optional. But I think it is. So if I hit Command Z, yes, it is optional. I'm seeing things today. So again, like everything else with Firebase, we can check for that error. So if let error is equal to error, then again, we can show the user the error. So utilities dot show alert error. What's the string? Well, we can give them the localized description and pass over this view controller. Okay, and of course, if we have an error, we don't want to continue, so we're going to return. Right, so if we don't have an error, then we can actually show the user a message, and this was the third part of the homework, to let them know the reset has been sent. So utilities dot show alert. And we get something like success. Please check your email inbox for a password reset link. And the view control, of course, is self. So that should take care of all of the logic for resetting the password. But as always, let's double check that. Let's head over to our simulator. Let's first click forgot. Please enter an email. Fine. And let's put a wrong email in at first. At whatever, it doesn't matter. Let's click forgot. There we go. The user may have been deleted. So we get the same error that we had before when we were trying to log in with the wrong user. So again, this is a nice clue for a hacker if they wanted to hack your stuff. Let's see what happens if we put, what was his name? Harry. And let's forgot his password. Success, please check your email inbox for a password reset link. Now, when you go to Harry's Hotmail, you should be able to see a password reset link. Now, it'd be funny if this was Prince Harry's Hotmail because he was the first one on there. And he keeps getting these Firebase password reset links. Even funnier if he was taking this course because he wants a career change. Anyway, let's stop that running. So our logic more or less works for this items. Now, at the moment, it seems pretty much all right, but as you continue to use the app, you're going to find little bits where you want to change the logic a bit, and that's perfectly fine. At this stage of me teaching you, you should be thinking thoughts like that, like I'd actually liked it like this and not like the way Grant does it. Because we're all different, you have your preferences, and they aren't necessarily the same as mine. So if you want to shuffle things around, please feel free. Anyway, that's the homework and the solution sorted. So we have a login, we have a registration. Now all we need to do is send and receive some textual data, some messages if you like. So we're going to set up just a plain old table view in order to receive and show that data to our user. So open up your project and let's create one. Now previously, we have actually created a UI table view controller, which laid out all of the template code for us. This time, we're going to do things slightly differently. So we're going to go over to our storyboard, and we're going to go to our main view controller. So we're no longer interested in registration and login. And it's inside of here that we are going to drop in a table view. So simply come over to our filter at the bottom right and type table. And previously we had one of these, but now we're actually going to have just a plain old table view. And the reason we're doing this is so we can add other elements into our app if need be. So I'm going to click and drag this into here. And then I'm just going to position this to the sides. I'm going to remove these margins and I'm going to give it zeros all around. And you just hit tab after you've pressed these items, and then it should have add for constraints at the bottom. When you do that, it'll fill out our main view. Okay, so we have our standard table view. So I'm just going to save that, and I'm just going to switch to another file, then come back to it so it expands. Sometimes there's a graphical glitch that the table view doesn't actually show. Now, you'll notice that this table view, in stark contrast to the table view controller, doesn't actually come with a cell. So I'll just show you what I mean by that. If I drop in a table view controller up here, which we can delete, it does come with a cell. So table view, cell, whereas the other one just has a table view. So let's remove this. Just select it, hit backspace. Let's come back to our original table view. So we need to drop in a cell, and you'll notice in our Object Explorer, we have a cell available, table view cell. So we're going to click and drag that in, and it should drop it into the top. And now it looks similar to when you drag in a table view controller itself. We have a table view cell, and we have the content view itself. So click on the cell, and remember, we have to set a reuse identifier in the top right. So what shall we call this? Perhaps message table view cell. Okay, and remember, it's this string identifier we use to recycle and create new cells for our app as we're scrolling. Okay, so I'm just going to copy that for now, and we're going to use it in a little while once we've created the bits and pieces we need. Right. Now we need to actually outlet this. We need to reference the table view itself to our view controller class. So open up the assistant editor and then simply control click and drag the table view, not the cell. Make sure it's the table view selected. You can control click and drag from the table view itself on this list on the left-hand side to be sure. And we can drop that somewhere in our class. And we can simply leave this as an outlet, and we can call this perhaps messages table view, or we can just call it table view. Now, I haven't specifically named it because in iOS or Android for that matter, or Windows Phone, it's good practice to have only one table view in a screen. If you have more than one, things can get confusing, especially when it comes to layouts and scrolling and side scrolling as well. Some things can be a nightmare. So it's good practice to have one table view per screen. So hence, you can just call it table view. You don't actually have to say messages table view. Right. So we've done that. We've set our ID. We've got our cell. We've outletted it. Great. We can come back to editing and go to our view controller.swift. Now, in theory, we should change this to messages view controller, but we can leave it as the main screen, just as view controller for now. Right, we have our table view in there. Now, there's a couple of things a table view needs. First, it needs a data source. So our class has to inherit from UI table view data source. UI table view data source. There it is. It also needs a delegate, so it knows what to do when you tap things or slide things on the table, or indeed scroll the table. So this comes from UI table view delegate. Now Swift is going to give us a couple of errors and say you don't have all of the required methods that you need. So if you see something like this, does not conform to protocol, that means that Swift has said you need to have certain functions available to capture the data source or set the data source and or to fire off the delegates, and we haven't yet implemented them. But we will. Right. For now, we need to create a variable to hold all of our messages that come back from Firebase. So var messages, and this is going to be of a certain type. Now, previously, we have actually created a UI table view controller, which laid out all of the template code for us. This time, we're going to do things slightly differently. So we're going to go over to our storyboard, and we're going to go to our main view controller. So we're no longer interested in registration and login. And it's inside of here that we are going to drop in a table view. So simply come over to our filter at the bottom right and type table. And previously we had one of these, but now we're actually going to have just a plain old table view. And the reason we're doing this is so we can add other elements into our app if need be. So I'm going to click and drag this into here. And then I'm just going to position this to the sides. I'm going to remove these margins and I'm going to give it zeros all around. And you just hit tab after you've pressed these items. And then it should have add for constraints at the bottom. When you do that, it'll fill out our main view. Okay, so we have our standard table view. So I'm just going to save that. And I'm just going to switch to another file and come back to it so it expands. Sometimes there's a graphical glitch that the table view doesn't actually show. Now, you'll notice that this table view, in stark contrast to the table view controller, doesn't actually come with a cell. So I'll just show you what I mean by that. If I drop in a table view controller up here, which we can delete, it does come with a cell. So table view, cell, whereas the other one just has a table view. So let's remove this. Just select it, hit backspace. Let's come back to our original table view. So we need to drop in a cell, and you'll notice in our Object Explorer, we have a cell available, table view cell. So we're going to click and drag that in, and it should drop it into the top. And now it looks similar to when you drag in a table view controller itself. We have a table view cell, and we have the content view itself. So click on the cell, and remember, we have to set a reuse identifier in the top right. So what shall we call this? Perhaps message table view cell. Okay, and remember, it's this string identifier we use to recycle and create new cells for our app as we're scrolling. Okay, so I'm just going to copy that for now, and we're going to use it in a little while once we've created the bits and pieces we need. Right, now we need to actually outlet this. We need to reference the table view itself to our view controller class. So open up the assistant editor, and then simply control click and drag the table view, not the cell. Make sure it's the table view selected. You can control click and drag from the table view itself on this list on the left-hand side to be sure. And we can drop that somewhere in our class, and we can simply leave this as an outlet, and we can call this perhaps messages table view, or we can just call it table view. Now, I haven't specifically named it because in iOS or Android for that matter, or Windows Phone, it's good practice to have only one table view in a screen. If you have more than one, things can get confusing, especially when it comes to layouts and scrolling and side scrolling as well. Some things can be a nightmare. So it's good practice to have one table view per screen. So hence, you can just call it table view. You don't actually have to say messages table view. Right. So we've done that. We've set our ID. We've got our cell. We've outletted it. Great. We can come back to editing and go to our view controller.swift. Now, in theory, we should change this to messages view controller, but we can leave it as the main screen, just as view controller for now. Right. We have our table view in there. Now, there's a couple of things a table view needs. First, it needs a data source. So our class has to inherit from UI table view data source. UI table view data source. There it is. It also needs a delegate, so it knows what to do when you tap things or slide things on the table, or indeed scroll the table. So this comes from UI table view delegate. Now, Swift is going to give us a couple of errors and say you don't have all of the required methods that you need. So if you see something like this, does not conform to protocol, that means that Swift has said you need to have certain functions available to capture the data source or set the data source and or to fire off the delegates, and we haven't yet implemented them. But we will. Right. For now, we need to create a variable to hold all of our messages that come back from Firebase. So var messages, and this is going to be of a certain type, which will come from Firebase itself. So up at the top, we actually need to import just plain old Firebase. Now our messages will be of a type data snapshot. Now these will probably be an array of snapshots. It depends on how we're going to actually program this. So what I'm going to do is simply create an array of snapshots, which is empty for now. Like so. So we have an empty array of these Firebase data snapshots, and we're going to add to these, or overwrite them indeed, when we have some new data that actually comes in. Right, so now we have to implement these two items. And the first thing we're going to implement is the table view itself. So we've got our logout test. And what we can do actually right now is just remove this logout test. We don't need it. Our registration works perfectly fine. You can also delete this bit if you so wish. I am not going to delete it. I'm just going to move it to the bottom so it's out of our way. Right, now inside of here, let's get back to our table view. The first thing a table view needs to know is the number of rows in the section. So, actually it needs to know number of sections first of all. So let's return one section. Then it needs to know number of rows in the section. And if you just start typing these, Swift, or Xcode rather, will auto-complete everything that you need. So how many rows do we need? Well, we're going to return the messages dot count. So we're just counting the number in that array, and that will give us the correct number of rows. Okay, the next thing we need to do is get the cell for our table view. So we haven't actually set that yet. So this is cell for row at. Right, so this will allow us to get a cell. So let cell, which is of type UI table view cell, and we're just using the plain old cell that comes installed automatically. And we're going to grab this from the table view dot DQ reusable cell with an identifier. And you'll also notice you can also DQ a cell from a specific index path if you wanted to do that. That's a very special case. It's pretty unlikely you'll want to do that. With an identifier, and I've totally forgotten it, and I've overwritten my clipboard. So let's select our cell again, and there's our identifier. Let's go back and drop it in there. Okay, let me just make some space so you guys can see what's going on here. Now, DQ reusable cell, I believe this is an optional. We're going to fix that because we know that this is actually correct. Well, we should know that. Now we have to pull out the message. So let message, and this is going to come from our array of messages. So messages index path dot row. Okay, simple enough. And then message should have type of that data snapshot. It's not showing when I hover, but so what? Okay. Now, each snapshot that is eventually going to come back from Firebase is actually a dictionary. If you remember, it's JSON. We've dealt with JSON before. It's the same in Firebase. You get more or less a dictionary. So you get some keys and you get some values. And in our case, the key is going to be a string and the value will be a string. So let's grab the actual message content is equal to the message itself, which is the data snapshot. We're going to get the value of it. And you'll notice this comes back as any, which means it could be of any type. And we have to convert that. So as exclamation. So we're saying there's definitely a value and we're definitely converting it, and it will definitely work as a dictionary string, comma, string. Now, I know that converting to a dictionary of string and string is going to work. But if Firebase came back and it couldn't actually convert to a string, which is pretty unlikely to be honest, then we would get a crash here because we're trying to force unwrap something that doesn't actually exist as the object we say it is a type of. Right? So if your apps do crash, this is a great place to start checking stuff, to perhaps start introducing if-lets and that kind of thing. But as long as you are tightly specified on your database layout, you shouldn't get a crash there. Shouldn't being the magic word. Right. Now we're going to grab the actual text from our Firebase. So let text, and this is the text of the message we're actually going to show, is equal to the message content. And what are we going to pass in here? Well, normally we're actually going to pass in a string that is the key of the value we want from our JSON data. And then we're going to cast this as a string. Right, so we have to force unwrap that as string. Okay. And again, you can do some if-let checking here or some guard statements, guard else, that kind of thing. Right, now the question is, in message content, do I just want to say whatever my constants are in this? So for example, this might be a constant of message or something. Well, I've pointed to this before. This is dangerous because if you change this in one place, it won't change in other places. So what we should do before we carry on here is create a constants file. And this constants file will hold all of those structures for us. So again, this is a standard way that I do some of this stuff when I'm starting out. Constants file, and then I will create a structure called constants. And inside of that structure, you can create other structures. And what am I going to call this? Let's call this message fields. And you could put Firebase on that if you want to do that. Okay, and what sort of things are we going to have in here? Well, we'll actually have a static let, and we'll have something called a date time. And this key will be date time. And a static let, and we'll have a text, and this key will be text. So this is the message text. This is the date or time that we associate with when that was actually sent, because we're going to write these. So just to be clear, these are going to be the keys of the JSON data that's coming back from our Firebase. And we're just putting them in a structure so that we have them in a fixed place and we know where to change them if our data structure changes in the future. Right, so we've got that now. Actually, let me just save that so Xcode can find it. And now we can use it in this section as the key. So we can say constants dot message fields dot text. So now it knows what to go and substitute in there to look for the key. Now I know that these are the same thing, but this is just to get you used to good practice. You can imagine if you had a developer that called it something like this. That would be a right pain to write everywhere. So that's why we do this kind of thing. So undo and save and go back. Okay, so we've got our text. We can now grab our cell. We can get the text label. we can drop in the text that we have is equal to text. And finally, we can return that cell. Okay, and that Swift error should go away, and all the warnings should more or less go away. Force cast from string to string only unwraps optionals. We're going to see if that's an issue. Actually, I need to read this properly. Force cast from optional string to normal string only unwraps the optional. Did I mean to use exclamation? Man, these error messages are hard to read sometimes. They are tough. Did I mean to use exclamation? What it's saying is this has the same effect as this, I believe. So who knows why I did it the other way. There we go, we're unwrapping it. It should be fine because this will come out in the end as a string. Okay, so we can save that, we're sorted. Now the last thing we have to do is in view.didLoad, after we check our current user, is we're going to set the table view dot delegate is equal to self, not delf, self. And that's because we have actually told it it's this. And then we're going to have the table view dot data source is equal to, and you guessed it, self. Right, so we've done quite a lot there. Let's just run that in our simulator and just double check that everything is working. Oh, I don't have my sim running in the background. Okay, well it's built itself, so we should be all right. We should be logged in anyway on the sim. We should be good to go. Right, so just whilst that's loading in the background, we're just going to move on to the second bit of this section. It's very short, and that is coming back to our storyboard. We're actually going to create a text field in here, right at the bottom of the table view, that allows us to enter a message. So just before we do that, let's just do, what was his name? Harry at hotmail.com, password login. We're signed in, and what happened? We have an error. Oh dear. Oh dear. So clearly it's not firing off. So actually we have to go fix that before we move on. Let's go back to our auth view controller. And what we want to do, where are we? Login, error. Oh, we forgot to add our exit code inside of here, just under where we print. Silly me. So we can do that now. Let's just search for Command F, dismiss there. Not that. That. Copy that, go down to our login, and drop it in there. And that should fix that problem. Okay, I'm just going to play that again and double check that it all works. Well, we should actually be signed in now anyway. Yes, we're signed in. So that should work. We'll just ignore that for now. See, that's what I mean about debugging. Half of your life is spent doing it. So we have our table. It's scrolling. There's nothing in it. Fine. So we can stop that running. We know our table code more or less works in our main view controller section. Right. So coming back to our main storyboard, let's move up this table view just a touch. Let's remove this constraint at the bottom. Just select it, hit backspace. And then let's drop in a text field. And we can have this text field actually stretch across the whole of the bottom screen. Because it's, whoops, done the wrong thing there. Command Z, Command Z. I put it in a stack view by accident. So we can have this text view stretch from 0 here to 0 here. So that should go across the whole bottom of the screen. And then what are we going to do? Well, we can give it a position relative to the bottom. So we can go back to that and have a 0 down here. And then we can align the table view to this actual text view. So we don't actually want them, whoops. Hold down Control, click and drag. Have some vertical spacing. Perhaps about 10. So we don't want them actually touching. And we can come and jazz this up a bit later on. But we have our text field. Right, let's open up the Assistant Editor. Let's go from our text field, Control, click, and drag as an outlet. Whoops, Control, click, and drag. And what shall we call this? Message text field as an outlet. Oh, we've got that silly error. Control, click, and drag. Perhaps down here. Right, sorted. Okay, so we come back to our view controller. We have our text field sorted. And this is simply to enter text. Now, text fields have this special property, and it's called a delegate. And you've seen a delegate before for table view. So when you do something on the table view, it knows to come and look in this current instance of the class, which is basically all of this code. And it goes and finds the things that it needs to do. Text field can actually have the same idea. So we can have message text field dot delegate equal to self. Now that means when something happens in the text field, like we press return, then we can sort something out with it. So at the moment, we actually need to add this to our list of items in the view controller inheritance. So what do we need to add? It's UI text field delegate. And then inside of here, we can have what's called the text field should return. That's the one we want. But you'll notice there are tons of others you can use here. Should return. So when I hit return on my keyboard, it's going to do something, which is very handy because you'd enter your text, you press return, and it's going to send the message for us. Now, obviously, we don't have any plumbing for Firebase sending inside of our app yet. So all we're going to do here is print message writing ended. It's just for us as developers. Don't mind my bad spelling once again. So we print that out. And then we need to tell our keyboard to go away. So self.view.endEditing. And we can force that to be true. And then this text field should return needs to return a true. Just for now. Okay, so our error should actually go away. Right, so we're ready to go now. We have a table, we have a text field, we have something that happens when we click the return button. So let's hit play. And let's check that. Now, I know what's going to happen here. And I don't know if you know, but you're about to find out. We're in our app. We've got our text field at the bottom. It's not great layout. We can't really see what's happening. Our keyboard hasn't actually popped up. I don't know why. This is an error sometimes that we get with these things. So I'm just going to stop that running and then try it again. And the keyboard should actually pop up again. It's a little annoying working on the Sims sometimes. The keyboard just doesn't show. So I've got nothing here. All right, I'm just going to go fix this issue. I may need to use a real device just to check it. I'll see you in a few seconds. I found out what it was. if you go to hardware, because you're probably having this issue, you go to keyboard, this is under the simulator menu, connect hardware keyboard. When you have that on, sometimes it doesn't show the keyboard, even though it did before for us. So go to keyboard, turn that off, which is Shift-Command-K. And now when you click in the box, you have a keyboard with which to write. So you can write some stuff, whatever it is, you can return, and our return code works perfectly. Now, obviously, it's not perfect because we're blocking our actual view. So that's something we're going to move on to in the next lesson, how to stop that from happening. But just as a quick little revision, I'll just explain what we've done here just one last time. First, we set up a table view. We dropped in one into our view controller. We dropped a cell into that. We then inherited from the table view data source the table view delegate. We set them up in the view controller, and we set up the table view items here. So it's these three functions: number of sections, number of rows in section, and cell for row at. And then at the moment, we are, in theory, getting stuff out of our array of Firebase data, but there's nothing there, so there's nothing actually shown in our table. But that's fine. So I'm just going to mark these. Mark table view start. So when you look at this source code, you can actually see what's going on here. Table view end. Right, great. Now we had this item, text field should return, and that comes from the UI text field delegate. And when we set our message text field delegate, which was the message box at the bottom, as self, when we then hit the return button on our keyboard, this will fire automatically. And the beauty of this is we now don't actually need to have a separate button to send a message. We can just press return and the message will send automatically. I'm sure you've done the same on Facebook, where you press enter, it sends a message that you didn't actually want to send or you hadn't finished editing yet. Well, we're going to have the same functionality here. So it's up to you if you want to double check it before you send it or not. You can always give the user a pop-up if you so wish. But anyway, that's the basic idea of what we've done in this section. We're all set up to receive data and to send data. We've set up our user interface. Now all we have to do is code it. But before we code it, in the next section, I'm going to show you how to fix a very common problem, which is moving a view up or down when a keyboard is shown, so that our text field doesn't actually disappear. Right, it's time to do a little bit of tidying up before we actually plow into the Firebase code. What we're going to do is move our view, our main view, up or down, depending on whether or not our keyboard is showing. So if you recall, as it stands at the moment, the keyboard pops up for our main screen when we send messages, and we can't actually see the text box anymore, which is no good because we can't actually see what we're writing. So we're going to look at how to solve that, and we're going to solve it in a much more clever way than the ways you might come across on the internet. We're going to solve it using constraints and a custom constraints class or Swift file that we're actually going to create. So open up Xcode and follow along. Right, so here I am in our main storyboard. And if you recall, in our main view, we have a table view and we have this little text field. Now this text field, this message text field, has some constraints. And if we go over to the right-hand side and we click the ruler icon, we can scroll down and we can see all 4 of these constraints. Now what we would like to do ideally is change the bottom layout guide to one that is more fluid. So one that moves up and down depending on whether or not a keyboard is actually showing. And the way we're going to do that is by giving it a custom class that we're going to program. Now, this is a bit more of an advanced way of programming, but you'll get the hang of it pretty soon. If we double click that constraint, we can then select the class inspector and we can change the class that it belongs to. So at the moment it's a standard layout constraint, but we're about to create our own custom constraint to fit this. So let's do that now. Let's right click our project, new file, next, and let's call this a keyboard layout constraint. Okay, now because this is a layout thing, it's to do with our user interface, we first have to import the UI kit. So we have access to all of those classes, methods, and elements, etc. Now this is going to be a public class, and we're going to call it exactly the name of the file. Keyboard, what did I call it? Layout constraint. And this is going to inherit from NS layout constraint. And you know that because in your storyboard, when you click that constraint in the class at the top right, it shows you NS layout constraint. So that's why this needs to inherit from it. Okay, so we got our basic class. Now we need a couple of variables, and the first one we're going to keep track of is the offset of the view or the keyboard. So this is going to be a var offset, and this is going to be of type CG float. Now it's not just a float, it's a CG float because it's something to do with core graphics, and core graphics have something to do with the display that we're showing. So it's something you've got to watch out for occasionally. You can convert between float and CG float, but this is the standard type we want. So we're going to start with 0. We have no offset. Then we need to keep track of also our keyboard's height. So var keyboard visible height. And again, this is a CG float. And this is going to be 0 to start with, because our keyboard isn't actually showing at the start. Well, what's next? Well, we're actually going to override something inside of this class, and this is called awake from nib. Now, actually, if I just come back here and I type that so you can see the description, prepares the receiver for service after it's been loaded from an interface builder, archive, or nib file. Basically, all this means is everything's loaded, we're ready to go, we can access the variables. Right, so the first thing you have to do when you do this is you have to say super.awake from nib. So this is going to execute the standard awake from nib functions first, and then after that, we can put our custom code. Okay, so the first part of our custom code is offset is equal to a constant. Now, there is a way of making our code respond in, or rather, let me rephrase that. What we have to do is we have to register for when the keyboard appears and disappears. And the way we do this is by calling a notification center, and we grab the default instance, so it's the one we currently have access to, and we're going to add an observer to this. And this observer is going to fire whenever this notification is called. So if that sounds a bit confusing, don't worry about it. We're going to go through it bit by bit. So the observer is this current class. And then our selector, I think you've seen this before, I've shown you this before, is the actual method that's going to show when our notification is called. So actually, it's better if I type all this out and then explain what's going on. So we're going to type selector. And what do we need after this? Well, this selector, we have to specify in brackets. And what do we want? We want keyboard layout constraint. So that's this current class. And then we're going to call keyboard will show. Now there'll be an error here because we haven't actually created this yet. Okay, now this needs a name, which I believe is a string. If we just hover here, it should tell us. No, it won't, but I believe it's a string. And we can give this a default name, NS notification dot name dot, and we want UI keyboard will show. So this just gives it a standard tag, if you like, so we know how to reference it. And then the object is nil, so let's not worry about that for now. Right, so all I've done here is I've said I've subscribed to the notification center inside of this class, wherever this class is actually applied, or the object we create from this class. And I've said whenever something happens to do with UI keyboard will show, then I would like you to fire off this method. So in a way, I'm listening for something to happen. And when it does, I know what to do. Right, so we need to copy this and we need to paste it. Why? Because we also have a different notification, which is when our keyboard disappears. So keyboard, and this is known as will hide. So let's change all the shows to hide. Keyboard will hide. Okay, so we've got our methods that fire up and we've subscribed to these notifications. Now, before we actually write the keyboard will hide and will show code, what we actually need to do is remember to do something extremely important, very important, and that is to remove these notifications if the object created from this class gets deinitialized, i.e. destroyed for all intents and purposes. And the way we do that is we fire up the dinit. And you'll notice the description at the top says performs a cleanup before an object is deallocated. So this gives us a chance to remove all of the garbage that we don't want hanging around and hogging our memory and perhaps firing events on view controllers that aren't there anymore. So we have to get rid of all the notification center.default, and we're going to remove the observer, which is self. So we're getting rid of all of these notifications if we destroy this object. Okay, now we can actually write these functions. So let's do that round about here. Now this is left over from the Objective-C days, and I'm not too sure about this. I don't have a full explanation, I haven't looked it up, but I know you have to declare this as an Objective-C function. And because, hey, let's face it, as good as I am, I don't know everything. So let's have a keyboard will show. And what we actually want to do here is we want to grab the notification that comes with it. So what we're going to do is type underscore notification, which is of type notification. And then open and close our curly braces before we forget it. Now I'll explain what underscore means in a second, but we actually have to now go and match this keyboard will show to include this notification. So in keyboard will show, open and close your brackets, and then inside of there, we're actually going to pass over underscore colon. And now here's a good place to explain why we've put an underscore. Generally in Swift, we put an underscore, and I believe this was from Swift 3 this started happening, or perhaps Swift 2, I can't remember exactly. But we put an underscore when we don't actually want to name the argument that we're passing over. So we're putting an underscore, and then in this section, and I believe I'm right on this, but don't quote me on it, we're saying whatever you've received that's unnamed is now going to be named notification, and it will be of type notification. And we know that's going to be the case because the notification center passes over a notification. So it's a bit convoluted, and I apologize on Apple's behalf, not my behalf. It's the way we have to do things, that they do it like this. I think it would be better if we were forced to put that into here instead of the underscore. But basically the underscore means that the argument passed over doesn't yet have a name. And so inside here, we now have a chance to give it a name by putting the underscore in. Again, I'm not too sure about that, but I believe that's exactly. You can't be not sure and say exactly. But I believe that's what it is. If you find out, then feel free to tell me, and I'll let everybody else know, and of course, give you some credit. Right, so we've done that now. Now what we have to do is get the information from the notification. Now this is optional, so if let user info is equal to notification, and this is the passed over one, so lowercase n, dot user info. And this gives you back all the values and objects related to this notification. So if we get that, then we're good to continue. And then what do we want to get? Well, we want to actually get the size of the keyboard whilst or just before it's going to show. Now, when you get these notifications, the keyboard is actually not showing yet, but it's telling you through the notification, I'm about to show to the user. And inside of that notification, you can get a whole bunch of values, and you can look up the docs for this, but I'm going to save you from that pain. One of those values tells you where the keyboard will finish. So at the moment, it's animating. It's going from not showing to completely showing. And inside of there, it's telling you where it starts and where it ends. So we're going to try and get the end spot. So again, this is optional. If let, and this is known colloquially as a frame value. So the keyboard has a frame going around it, if you like, and we're just trying to get the values of where that is and what size it is. Okay, so if let frame value is equal to, and we get our user info, so that's all the data that came with it. And then what do we have to do? Well, we have to get a key value pair out of this. And this one, very long name, is UI keyboard frame end user info key. It's a long name, isn't it? Right, so we're saying, where is the keyboard going to end up? Give me the value for that particular key. And again, this is optional, as, and we have to cast this as what's called an NS value. And this is a generic value, so it could actually be anything. Right, so we now have where our keyboard is going to end up. Now we can actually grab the frame of the keyboard, which comes from our frame value dot cgrect value. So it returns the core graphics. Remember, core graphics has to do with UI kit and all of the UI stuff we're seeing. And it returns the rectangle structure of this value. So basically, it's just a position and a size that we're getting out of this. Right, I'm sorry, this is really long-winded, but in the future, when you make apps, all you have to do is copy this file and you are sorted for your keyboard moving up and down. It's a great way to save a lot of time. Right, so we've got our frame, but we don't just need the width or the size, we actually need the height because we're moving stuff up and down. So we are going to set our keyboard's visible height. And I'm not sure, yes, we're going to set this now because we have the frame where it's going to end. So keyboard visible height is equal to the frame we just got dot size, so we can get the size of it, dot height. And of course, conversely, if you wanted to know it, you could actually get the width too, amongst a whole bunch of other variables if you were programming something else. Right, now the next thing we're going to do here is self.update constant. And we haven't created this yet, so we'll do it now, and we'll also learn exactly what it's for. So function update constant. And what we're going to do is, remember we have a constant CG float. is equal to the offset plus the keyboard visible height. So we're just keeping track of all the heights that we're calculating, because remember, we have to move things up and down according to the size of the keyboard. Now here's some bad news for you, is the keyboard is a different size on most iOS devices, depending on the size of the screen, the rotation, the resolution, and all of that jazz. So you have to be careful, and you have to do it programmatically like this. You can't just say, move the keyboard by 200 screen points, because that could be an error on your various devices. Right, so I'm not going to explain too much what's going on in this file because it's quite complicated and I don't want to overwhelm you. I've told you the basics of what we're doing, which is moving stuff around according to the keyboard height. That's all you really need to know in order to get going. Right, so what's next? After we've updated that constant, so now we're going to have a switch case statement. You should know what these are by now. And the thing that we're going to switch, the thing that we're comparing against, is the user info. And we're going to grab the value out of this user info that corresponds to UI keyboard animation duration user info key. And the reason we're grabbing this is because the keyboard is going to animate over a certain time period, and we need to know what that is. So as, and this is going to be an NS number. Okay, and then we also need to get the user info UI keyboard animation curve user info key. And again, this is going to be as an NS number. And we're going to compare these two items in our switch case. All right, so if you're not sure what's going on, it's fine. I really don't want to go into depth on this because I really don't think you need it. I think it's good enough to actually copy this and just get some swift practice whilst we're at it, because it is quite complicated. So the first case is where we let dot sum duration dot curve, or dot sum rather, that should be dot sum, and it's curve. Okay, just check my brackets there, that's all working. Great. So in this case, we've got a duration and a curve. We're going to create an options variable, which is equal to a UI view animation options, which has a raw value of curve.uint value. So you can see what I mean when I say this stuff is complicated. I mean, even I don't understand exactly everything that's going on here. I get the basic gist of it, but I don't think you need to understand this. UI view dot animate, and we want animate with duration, delay, options, animations. Duration, delay, options. I think it's this one. Yes. Delay, options. Yes, great. So with duration is a time interval of duration dot double value, and the delay itself is going to be 0. The options are the one we've just created. On animations, you can just hit enter on this and it will give you a little code block to complete. So the animations is UI application window. Is it window? No, it's UI application dot at shared that we want. So if we just look at what that says, shared returns the singleton app instance. So you can think of this as like the big bad container that holds your current app. So shared dot key window dot layout if needed. So what I'm going to do is just explain bits and pieces here because there's a lot going on. Layout if needed will take all of the views inside of your view controller, or your view inside the view controller, if you like. And it says, do I need to lay all these out because something has changed? And what we're saying is, yes, you actually need to do that. So that's what layout if needed means. Okay, and once we've done that, we can return. And on completion, just double click this. We have a bool, so we can call this finished. And we can leave those brackets in, I believe. We don't actually need any code once it's finished. Okay, so basically, in this case here, what we're saying is, I want you to animate things and shift things around if needed because something has appeared on the screen. And the something in this case happens to be the something that is attached to this layout constraint. Okay, so don't worry about it for now. We're just going to carry on and pretend we know exactly what's going on with all of this code. And the default is just simply to break, stop executing the switch. Right, so that's a lot of code for just a keyboard will show. But this code is going to form the basis of pretty much every app you create that requires some textual input. You will need to move the view up and down, and this is going to do it for you very simply. Okay, now what do we need here? Well, we need to copy this, will show, Command C, and we need to paste it and change it to keyboard will hide. Because recall that if we press return, the keyboard disappears, and we need to shift everything around again. So let's paste this under here, and let's change this name to keyboard will hide. And again, this passes over a notification. And what do we want in here? Well, we know the keyboard is hiding. So first of all, we need to set our keyboard's visible height to 0, because we know it's going away. We don't need to do any checking. We know that's going to happen. And then we need to update the constant, so we know we can keep track of the height that the keyboard is at. And then if we can get our user info out of here, we don't actually need to have this frame part. We don't need to track it because we know it's disappearing, so we can use the whole screen. So we can just delete that. We can also remove the update constant here. And then we can switch the animation. So this is the same. We're keeping track of these animations and the curves to do with the animations. And again, this is complicated stuff, so we're just going to sort of glance over it a bit. Just copy it. Trust me, sometimes it's better just to copy. So we have some duration, some curve. Yes, that's correct. We have our options. That's correct, I think. I'm just double checking for my own sanity. We're going to animate, delay, options, applications, and we're saying something's disappeared, so I would like you to lay this out if needed. And when it's completed, we're fine, we're good to go. Right, so I think that's more or less done. Save any errors we haven't seen yet. Right, and now we come to the actual glue that's going to attach this to our view. Now, because it's a constraint, we can go to our main storyboard. We can go to our text field. We can go to our bottom space, because this is the one that interests us. We want to move this up and down. We can double click it. We can go to the class inspector, and we can now set this layout constraint. And hit enter once it's selected. Save your items. Right, so before we look at this running on the sim, I'll just explain this roughly speaking, a broad overview, because I think that's more helpful for you. We've set a constraint, And the constraint we've programmed ourselves, and we've programmed it so it listens for when a keyboard is going to show or it's going to hide. And we know that because that's the name of the notification that we've subscribed to. Then our class will go and fire off the will show and will hide items. It'll grab the data it needs from the notification that tells us everything that's happening. And from that, we can grab the keyboard's height, and then we can double check what's happening with switch case, and we can shift things around with an animation that actually matches the animation of the keyboard. Because when you click the keyboard, it slides up or across or whatever iOS is doing. And what we'd like to do is move our view in an animated manner to match the keyboard. So we could just move the whole view, this UI view, but that would suck. It would look really bad. It would just go like really jerky. Bang, it's there, and then the keyboard would slide up. We don't want to do that. Hence the complexity in here when we're actually getting the animation duration and the curve of the animation. Now, by curve of animation, imagine a graph of a sine wave or a cosine or whatever. It goes up really slow to start with and then shoots up, comes back down, and slows down at the end. And in animation terms, that's what we're talking about when we say a curve. Because an animation doesn't just start, go at a constant speed, and stop. That looks very dated. Nowadays, it's a curve. So if you watch my cursor, it goes up very slowly, and then up faster, and then down very slowly and stops. And it makes everything much smoother. Okay. Have a quick break. My throat hurts. It's a lot of talking. I'm going to hit play, and let's see if I have done my work correctly for moving this keyboard up and down. Here we go. So we're already logged in. Let's click this item at the bottom, and there we have our keyboard moving around so we can type stuff. We can press return, and it's gone. Now, what I want you to pay close attention to is when I click this text field, everything animates at the same speed. And I want you to notice that the animation starts slow, speeds up, and then slows down at the end. Just watch it carefully. So you'll notice it kind of slows as it pulls into the station, if you like trains. Slows down, speeds up, slows down. Okay, so that is, I would say simple, but it wasn't really that simple, was it? That is a great way of moving things up and down. Now, I discovered this method somewhere on Stack Overflow, and I don't know where it was, but it was an open source license, so we're free to use this code. And before this, I actually used to do this in the view controller itself, which is one way of doing it. You can find references to that way of hiding and showing the keyboard and moving the view programmatically that way, but I think this is a fantastic way. Just change your constraints to move stuff up and down, and then see what's going on with your animations, and make your view movement match your animations. So, I know this has been a long lecture. Well done for sticking it out. It was a tough one. All right, I'll see you in the next one. Okay, it's time for you guys to do something yourselves. I'm going to set you a little bit of homework. Now, I've already set up the data structure for you, so your tasks are fairly simple, but they'll need a bit of thought going into them. The first thing I want you to do is add the date and time to the message packet that you send to Firebase in the send message function. Now, these can be separate. You can have a separate date and time, or you can lump them together. Totally up to you. And recall, I've already set up that array data structure for you, so you don't really have to think about it that much. Then, once you've done that, you actually have to display the date and time like any messaging app would. You want to know when the message was sent. So, what you're going to do is use the detail text label property in the standard cell in your table view. And to do that, you will need to change the cell type in storyboards, or you'll get a crash when you try to write to its text property. So, good luck. bonne chance, as they say in France, and pause the video now, have a good go at it, and I'll see you in a few seconds, or half an hour by the time you've done this, to see what my solution to this problem is. Right, here we go. Here are my solutions to the tasks I set you, which were to add the date and time to the message packet, and also display that date and time. So open up Xcode and compare your solution to mine. Now, the trickiest bit, of course, I think, is actually getting the date out of Swift, and you probably had to go on Google and search for this. So what we're going to do is just go to our utilities.swift and add a little date getter in here. So let's have a function for getDate, and this is just going to return a nice simple string. We don't need anything more than that, really. Okay, now how do you get date out of your iOS system? Well, you have to create a new date. So let today's date, which is a type of date, equal to a new date object. And I think I've done this before with you. Then we need a date formatter. So let date formatter equal to a new date formatter. And you'll notice here I've specified what type it is, but here I haven't. And it doesn't really matter because Swift infers the type from what we're creating here. Right, now the formatter, we can actually specify what we want. So you can make this anything you like. Date formatter dot date format is a string. So we can have equal to, and there are codes that go with the various elements of the date. So 2 capital M's is the month, 2 lowercase d's is the day, 4 lowercase y's is the year, and you can put a regular space in there. 2 capital H's is the hour, and 2 lowercase m's is the minute. So obviously that's different to this. This is case sensitive. And you can format this any way you like, and you can also look up Apple's documentation for formatting the date. Now all we have to do is return that date. So return the date formatter dot, and we're going to create a string from the date. Today's date. So that's going to get the date for us. Okay, so we're going to save that file. Then we'll go back to our view controller where we want to get the date. And in our send message, we can add the date onto what we've got there. So you do have an option. You can add the date into text field should return into this data packet, but it's not really part of text field should return if you think about it logically. It's more something that you send with every message. So what we should do is actually include it in send message. And this is simple enough. We can just add something to our data, and we can give it the key, which is coming from our constants dot message fields dot date time, which is a string. And then we go get the time, which comes from our utilities dot get date. We could actually name that get date time just to be a little bit more correct with our naming. And what do we have here? Because data is a let constant. Okay, so we have a very slight issue here. When we say let, what we're saying is you're not going to change this constant. And what we're trying to do is add something to it. So we can get around this. We can say let, or rather, I've just put the same problem in there. Var packet is equal to data. That's fine. And then instead of data, we can just have packet here. And then we can also send the packet here. So that was a little gotcha waiting to get you when you did this. Okay, so that should send off the date and time. And we're going to test that in a second. But first of all, what we should actually do is go over to our Firebase and remove the old data, because you don't want to be changing data formats. It's going to introduce lots of errors. So when you're developing, it's always a good idea to wipe the database, start again when you change something. That's simple enough to do. You just have to go up to messages, hit the little X, and delete it. Everything is gone. You can also do this programmatically, delete everything in your database, but be careful about that, obviously. Right, so now we can run it in our sim. Let's just close that. Too slow. There we go. It's installing. We should have no messages. And now we can test out sending a whatever message. Return that. Go over to our database. We now have date time added and just. Okay, and it's also worth pointing out that date times actually have a unique or a standard format that you can apply to your own date times. We're not doing that here because it's just for a very simple app, but if date times are important to the data structure of your app, it's worth looking up stuff like, I forget what it's called now. There is a standard for showing a date in this format. There's also another standard called Unix time. And Unix time, it simply measures the number of seconds since January the 1st, 1970. So that's the current Unix time for the date that we have today. Just things for you to be aware of. Okay, so that all works. We get our date. We can stop that running, but we can't show our date yet. So what we should do is change this was the second part of the homework, the table view. And before we do that, go to our storyboard, and we actually need to change the cell type to be, and if we go over to its properties and go to its style, we can get a subtitle type. So we have a title, subtitle, and subtitle is where we're going to show that date. So coming back to our view controller, we can now go into our cell for row at. We can say cell dot detailed text label dot text is equal to, and what is it equal to? Well, recall we pulled out our message content here. So we're going to grab our message content. And what's the key? Well, the key, again, is installed in this very useful constants file, dot message fields dot datetime. Okay, and we're pretty sure it's there, but as usual, here we're unwrapping an optional. It's totally up to you if you want to check this. And actually, when it comes to stuff from the internet, it's a very good idea to add an if-let to make sure we get this message content. And in fact, it's such a good idea, we're going to do that right now. So if-let datetime is equal to, I'll just remove this, our message content, etc. Then and only then will we set a cell detail text label text equal to the date time. And I'm actually going to do this for this section too. So if let the text is equal to this, we can remove the unwrap, open and close braces, and we can drop that in to there. And what we're doing here is it's disaster prevention. We're making sure that if something gets messed up on our database, our user isn't going to feel that in the app. So that's pretty important. Now, of course, you can also do it up here to double check, but I think you get the idea, so you can feel free to do that yourself. So now I'm going to save that, and now we can pull out our detailed text label, which is the date. So let's hit play. Let's go over to our little iPhone. And we should have the date showing. So it'll get the data, and there we have our first message. We can send the next bit of data, return, and there we have it showing again. So you can see that by having a decent data structure and having an understanding actually of how table views and cells and things work, later on you can add loads and loads of different things to this data structure, and you'll be able just to change your table view, you change your send message, and the system takes care of everything else. So as a developer, I'm going to give you a good piece of advice here. I can't remember where I learned this, probably through tough experience, is it's better to understand the systems first, even though it's boring to do so, because when you do that, it frees you up in terms of having to create a data structure. As long as you have a basic structure, you can always add to it later and improve things because you understand how table views work. You understand how adding items to your data packets works. So all you have to do is add a couple of lines or even remove a couple of lines and everything still just works. So, for example, if I remove this little packet where we added the time and I saved it, now in our table view, we don't have a date time. So this, in theory, won't work. But we've checked for it, so we can stop this running. We can press play. We can go back here to our sim. And when it first loads up, we'll get our two messages. It's all fine, all good. But when we send another message, we're not adding the date time this time, or whatever it is. Hit return, and we have nothing. We have this default subtitle, and of course you can change that, but my grander point behind all this is you've changed your data structure, you've removed something, but your app still works. And I would wager, I'm not totally sure, that if you'd force unwrapped this, then you would have a very big issue. So I'm just going to show you what that looks like. Let date time equals this. I've force unwrapped it, even though it's not there. Let's run it on the sim. And let's see what kind of messes we can wrap ourselves into here. It's going to get the data. We have fatal error, unexpectedly found nil while unwrapping an optional value. So there we go. We've got a nice red crash. We can click the line, bad instruction. And that corresponds to a crash. Our app is not responsive. And in reality, if you weren't connected to Xcode, the app would just disappear. And I'm sure you've had that experience before because I didn't double check this. So stop that running. And let's fix everything. So now you understand, the realities behind checking things before you do them. When you're getting stuff from the internet, always check it. Okay, enough of me prating on about that. No one likes to be lectured too much. Right, let's actually tidy things up a bit. There's something that's annoying me with this app, and that is when you send a message. Oh, bang, we've still got the old version. But when we send a message, the text that we had in the little text field, I press return, it doesn't go away. So when you want to send a new message, it's still there. And that's a problem, obviously. So we can stop that running and we can repair that. But first, let's repair the damage I've done here. Let's get that packet back, save it. Let's go back to our Firebase, delete the messages. Okay. So we want to clear that text. Text field should return is going to do that for us. So after we've ended the editing, after we've sent our message, we are simply going to say text field dot text is equal to a blank string. So we've removed it. Okay, now this is a strange case, and it's something that comes up as you develop as a developer, pardon the pun, is these things you'd think you just put here. But this is something I would cut and I would create a totally separate function for. Clear text field like this, and then I would drop that in. But even more than that, I would actually pass over this text field. So I would say text field of type, of type UI text field. Okay, and then I would actually cut this, and I wouldn't have it in here. I would have this in utilities. Now you can create a different utilities file for UI items, but we're not going to do that. We're going to keep it simple file, and we're going to put it in here because this sort of functionality is something you're going to do fairly often. So why have it in more than one place? Let's go back to our view controller, and we can call our utilities dot clear text field, and we can pass over the text field. Save, we can hit play, and that should do what it needs to do for us. Okay, and as I say, these things just come from experience and understanding what's going on. So send off our message, return, and the text field has cleared, it's disappeared. We've got everything sorted. Brilliant. Okay, so that was the first thing that was annoying me, but we fixed it. The next thing that's annoying me is it looks a bit bland. So let's go to our storyboard, and let's go to our table view, and especially our header of our app, or the top bar, which comes from the nav controller. So we have our little top bar. Now we can click our nav controller, and you'll notice there's a navigation bar that we can change. So that looks quite good. I think what we can do here is we can look at its properties over at the top right, and we can change some items. So let's see what bar tint does. Let's go to that green that we knew. There we go, we've changed our bar tint. Now, bizarrely, background, if we click background and we select a random color, doesn't actually do anything. So I don't really know the reason for that, but it's not background for these bars. It is actually called bar tint. Okay, and I've just applied this green color that we had in this main screen. Okay, now we need a title because it looks a bit lame. So remember we had this little title and we had this Bodoni old style book font. Well, let's go to our view controller, double click the, I would say double click the bar, but it's not working. Click the navigation item, go over to title, and let's call this chat. And hit enter, and now we have it. Now, quite annoyingly, we can't change the color of the text in here, and that's because we have to go back to our nav controller, and we have to change the text color in here, or the font. So title color will be white, and that should change it here. Let's double check that by running it in the iPhone SE. It's a bit annoying. Sometimes Storyboard doesn't change the things that it should be changing, or the properties aren't actually obvious. See, it's white in our app, but it's not in Storyboard. So perhaps if we reload the Storyboard just by clicking off and then clicking again, still nothing. So I don't know, sort it out, Apple. Anyway, let's also change our font, and as usual, I've forgotten what the font was over here. Bodoni's old style book or something. So let's go to our nav controller, font, custom, yes. Now we run into a slight problem. We can't use the font that we want to use inside of that little section. So the ways around this are actually to have a picture that we can put up here, an image. And we could use the image here in chat if we wanted. But it's not really what I was aiming this lesson at. So, I'm just making you aware of some items that you need to be aware of. So what we can actually do is just change it to a system italic, which of course doesn't show in here, not surprised. But we should have it, hopefully, showing at the top of our app. And we don't. So, welcome to the wonderful world of things not working in Xcode. That's because I've sent a stupid font size of 0. So let's go back to, custom now works. Welcome to Xcode Bugs, everyone. And we can now have Bodoni 72. It was old style, wasn't it? Italic. And done. Doesn't show in here, but we can hit play. Honestly, sometimes I don't know about Xcode. It's just, why don't you update stuff? Anyway, now we have our chat up at the top, and we can actually increase that size by a few points. And again, a little Xcode bug here. Stop that running. I can't actually select the button now. Nice one, Apple. So view controller, main storyboard. There's the button. Let's put it up to 24 and run that. We're almost there. Right, nice. So that matches our little login. Now, this text field at the bottom isn't obvious, so let's fix that. Let's go over to our main view controller, select the text field, make sure it's selected. We can increase the font there if we want. We can actually also change our background color. So where is it? Here it is. And we can use a previous color, green, to match our app. We can change the text color to white. That's going to match everything that we're doing in our app. And then most messaging apps actually align things to the right. So we can select a right aligned section. Now when we hit play, we're starting to get a bit more into the usability and the user interface of this, which it gives it a much better feel overall. So now I can select my little message box. I can type, and everything is white colored. I can return, and off it goes. Now, of course, you can set all of these items here, if you so wish, to different colors, different fonts, totally up to you. I think it looks all right. The final thing we're going to do is get rid of this gray bar. So we've done this before. Let's go to our view controller, and let's go to our table view section. And let's look for did select row at. Okay, and then we're going to get our table view dot, and I always forget what this is called. I think it's deselect row at. That's it. At the index path and animated true. Anyway, let's also change our font, and as usual, I've forgotten what the font was over here. Bodoni's old style book or something. So let's go to our nav controller, font, custom, yes. Now we run into a slight problem. We can't use the font that we want to use inside of that little section. So the ways around this are actually to have a picture that we can put up here, an image. And we could use the image here in chat if we wanted. But it's not really what I was aiming this lesson at. So, I'm just making you aware of some items that you need to be aware of. So what we can actually do is just change it to a system italic, which of course doesn't show in here, not surprised, but we should have it, hopefully, showing at the top of our app, and we don't. So, welcome to the wonderful world of things not working in Xcode. System, that's because I've sent a stupid font size of 0. So let's go back to, custom now works. Welcome to Xcode bugs, everyone. And we can now have Bodoni 72. It was old style, wasn't it? Italic. And done. Doesn't show in here, but we can hit play. Honestly, sometimes I don't know about Xcode. It's just, why don't you update stuff? Anyway, now we have our chit-chat up at the top, and we can actually increase that size by a few points. And again, a little Xcode bug here. Stop that running. Like, I can't actually select the button now. Nice one, Apple. So view controller, main storyboard. There's the button. Let's put it up to 24 and run that. We're almost there. Right, nice. So that matches our little login. Now, this text field at the bottom isn't obvious, so let's fix that. Let's go over to our main view controller, select the text field, make sure it's selected. We can increase the font there if we want. We can actually also change our background color. So where is it? Here it is. And we can use a previous color, green, to match our app. We can change the text color to white. That's going to match everything that we're doing in our app. And then most messaging apps actually align things to the right. So we can select a right aligned section. Now when we hit play, we're starting to get a bit more into the usability and the user interface of this, which it gives it a much better feel overall. So now I can select my little message box, I can type, and everything is white colored. I can return, and off it goes. Now, of course, you can set all of these items here, if you so wish, to different colors, different fonts, totally up to you. I think it looks all right. The final thing we're going to do is get rid of this gray bar. So we've done this before. Let's go to our view controller, and let's go to our table view section. And let's look for did select row at. Okay, and then we're going to get our table view dot, and I always forget what this is called. I think it's deselect row at. That's it. At the index path and animated true. Now let's play this, and we should have everything that we need. So now when we select, it deselects the row for us. And there's some other things you can do. You can remove these gray lines if you wish. You can change the lines to the gray colors. I'm not going to cover that now, but you can just look that up, how to remove the sort of, I don't know what you would call them, the splitters, that's a bad word, the lines in table view. You'll find what you need to find on the internet for that one. So that is our app, a little bit spruced up, and you now have a pretty thorough understanding of how Firebase does what it does. All right, guys, you're really getting advanced now in iOS development. We've created a whole really simple WhatsApp clone, chit-chat. I mean, we haven't created chats between different people, but you've got the basic idea. You've got the nuts and bolts that if you wanted to make a real WhatsApp clone, you could do that. It would take a few months. I'm not going to lie to you. And then a few months after that to get it actually working properly. But you have, again, the nuts and bolts. So we've covered a lot in this section. We've created a nice chit-chat app, and you can see I've modified it slightly to make things a bit larger and more bold. Totally up to you how you design yours. It's your app after all. Right, so the things that we've learned, table views, we've looked at table views and how to embed them in a view controller rather than using a table view controller, which is the stuff we've done previously. So it's just like a nice refresh for you. We looked at how to create our Firebase app online, how to user login and register any new users that want to register in your app. We also looked at how your database wouldn't let you read or write unless the user was actually logged in. We looked at how to reset their password via email. So Firebase does this all automatically for you. We looked at how to send and receive data back and forth to databases, how to listen for new data updates, which is a great Firebase thing to do. We also looked at a little pitfall that was you have to deregister your listener when your view disappears. That's a very important thing to know. And then finally, we smartened things up. We added that little selector. We made the gray selector go away. We just changed the fonts here and there. We looked at some of the idiosyncrasies of Xcode not actually showing us our changes sometimes, but it happens. So there's a warning for you. Run it on the sim, run it on a real device, and see if it actually works there before wondering if you've done something wrong in Xcode. Always, always test for everything. Right, so congratulations, you've completed it. You deserve to buy yourself lunch, I think. And I'm going to leave you with your usual dose of fireworks.